The following story takes place between approximately 500,000 years ago
and 1485.
Today we'll begin with the highly anticipated series about English history. But before we dive in, I think it would be a good idea to set the stage and talk about geography for a bit. What is Great Britain? Well, it's this island right here, and in antiquity it was known as Britannia or Albion. Next to it is the island of Ireland, or Eire, or Hibernia, as the Romans used to call it. So then, what exactly is the United Kingdom? Well, first of all, it's a nation, not an island. A nation comprised by the countries of England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And yes, the title of this series is The History of England because, even though we will mention the other parts from time to time, we're going to focus primarily on England.
England!
Perhaps at some point in the future there will be videos about the rest of the UK. If you'd like that, you can let us know in the comments. For the most part, and broadly speaking, England is a generally flat country with practically no mountains. The northern region is the main exception, and that's where you can find the Pennine Hills, not to be confused with the Apennine Mountains in northern Italy.
I don't need a geography lesson from you, Luthor.
In Scotland, we find the most pronounced orography, specifically in the Grampian Mountains, which are home to Ben Nevis, the highest peak in the United Kingdom, with an altitude of 1,343 metres. In terms of rivers, the most famous river is the River Thames. Although it's only the second longest river in the United Kingdom, you've probably heard about it because it crosses the city of London. Other important ones are the Great Ouse, the River Trent, which crosses Nottingham, and the River Ouse. In addition, the River Severn, the longest in the land, starts in Wales, specifically in the Cambrian Mountains, thus called because Cambria was the ancient name for Wales. As you may know, the Cambric is also a geologic period of the Paleozoic age, and it was named thusly because it was first identified in Wales. Lastly, in the Scottish Highlands, we find the super famous Lake Ness or Loch Ness, which is known all around the world because many believe that its murky waters are home to a plesiosaur nicknamed Nessie. But they're not. Sorry to disappoint you. Around 500,000 years ago, Great Britain was not an island, but instead was connected to the European continent through a land bridge located in what today is called the English Channel. This was formed throughout the multiple ice ages that the Earth went through during the Paleolithic era. That was how our ancient ancestors, Homo heidelbergensis, began to populate these lands. They mostly spent their time hunting different animals, such as prehistoric elephants, rhinoceroses, and hippopotamuses. Yep, you heard that right. A long time ago, this area was full of such huge creatures.
Unaware they're about to go extinct.
Around 230,000 years ago, other ancient hominids, Homo neanderthalensis, began to arrive and replace the locals, quickly taking over their territories. Although our Homo sapien ancestors already existed at the time, there is no evidence that any of them set foot in Great Britain until roughly around 40,000 years ago. However, the number of modern humans was not significant until the end of the last ice age, around 13,000 years ago. The ice sheets melted, sea levels rose, and Great Britain became the island we all know today. I guess you could say that was the original Brexit 1.0.
Mistake after mistake.
Around 5000 BCE, the coastline was practically the same as nowadays, but that didn't mean that Great Britain was isolated from the rest of the world. The following centuries saw several waves of immigrants arrive from Europe, who introduced shepherding, farming of wheat and barley, and also ceramics. This brought the island into the Neolithic period, around 4000 BCE. At this time, different groups of humans settled down in the hills and started to build stockades and moats. One of the best known is the settlement of Windmill Hill, built around 3700 BCE. There were also burials at so-called long barrows, which are collective inhumation tombs that could reach up to 100 metres in length. Perhaps one of the oldest is the West Kennant Long Barrow, a tomb in Wiltshire County where numerous burials were carried out. This was the first significant example of megalithic construction in the British Isles. In about 2500 BCE, which is around the time when the Egyptians were building some of their most famous pyramids, a field north of present-day Salisbury witnessed the first construction stages of what would become the famous Stonehenge. Apparently, this monumental cromlech was an astronomical observatory which was used to predict seasons. Well, actually, this hasn't been entirely confirmed yet. It's just one of multiple theories about the place. In truth, scientists can't quite agree on the purpose of this site. Perhaps the people who built Stonehenge liked to celebrate rituals during the summer solstice. Archaeologists have also found burial sites nearby, but what they are definitely not is interdimensional portals, or the work of Merlin the Sorcerer, or temples built by aliens. Sorry, everyone.
What a load of rubbish!
What we do know are the construction techniques they used, which apparently took them almost 1,000 years. Yes, you heard that right, 1,000 years. And we've also found the remains of the homes where the builders lived. Another famous site, very close to Stonehenge, is Durrington Walls. In the interior of that circle, experts have found the remains of a Neolithic village from around 2500 BCE, comprised by a large number of homes built with mud and wood, all organised around a wide avenue which led to the River Avon. Right next door, there was a circular structure made of wooden posts, which some smart-ass named Woodhenge. Just like the stone version, we don't know the purpose of that structure, and in fact we don't even know whether it was open or had some sort of roof. Lastly, also close by, we have the West Amesbury Circle and the Cursus, an ancient long moat. What were they used for? Your guess is as good as anyone's.
It's an old imperial base.
The year 2500 BCE is commonly regarded as the start of the Bronze Age, and with it came a new wave of humans, the bell beaker culture, which, apart from being known for its bell-shaped ceramic jars, were also able to produce bronze weapons. This bronze was obtained by mixing copper and tin, and luckily for them, in the regions of Cornwall and Devon, there were massive tin deposits, so the south of England enjoyed a huge commercial success. This became the famous tin route, which crossed Gaul and reached various different points throughout the Mediterranean. It is believed that the people of the bell beaker culture gradually replaced 90% of the population in southern England. After them came the Wessex culture, who built necropolises comprised by large mounds where they buried their warrior elites. From this age, it's also worth mentioning the Uffington White Horse, a 110-metre-long figure sculpted into a chalky hillside in Oxfordshire. In case you didn't know, pure white chalk is quite common in the English south, think the White Cliffs of Dover. We also have the Long Man of Wilmington and the Giant of Cairn Abbas in Dorset, but it looks like these are only 300 years old and probably more of a prank or a joke.
These calls it a joke.
The last prehistoric period was the Age of Iron, which began around the year 800 BCE. Iron was super duper cool because it was much tougher and more abundant than bronze, and so people found it very useful to make tools and ploughs. And weapons, of course. There's always weapons. This materials technology was brought to Britannia by the Celts, who occupied large parts of the south for the next 1,000 years. These people were excellent craftsmen who used iron and other materials, and the society was very well organised. They gathered into tribes led by a king, and also had a nobility comprised of the toughest warriors. Below them were the priests, the famous druids, and then the lowest class of Celtic society were the peasants, shepherds, and slaves.
That doesn't sound fair to me at all.
These Celts had plenty of run-ins with the island's natives, especially with other fierce pre-Celtic warriors who lived in the north, known as the Picts. Because of this, the Celts began to build wooden fortresses throughout the land. The most notable were the hill forts, which featured complex systems of walls, moats, and embankments. Inside were the living quarters, usually round and made of wood, and then there were the grain silos raised on wooden poles. Some of the most famous are Maiden Castle in Dorset, Chun Castle in Cornwall, Edisbury Hill Fort in Cheshire, and East Lomond Hill Fort up in Scotland. Towards the end of 350 BCE, the Greek explorer Pytheas of Massalia surveyed the British coastline. Well, you've got to have a hobby, I guess. His is the first written record of the local history and customs, and thanks to him we know the super cool names of many British Celtic tribes, such as the Iceni, Brigantes, Coritani, Dumnoni, Dimente, Silures, Ordovices, Trinovantes, Canti, Redninsus, and others.
Oh, great band names!
These folks were gradually joined by new immigrants like the Belgae, who, as their name indicates, came from present-day Belgium, together with some Atrebates and perhaps also the Catavaluni. These Belgae gradually fused with the Britons, and their small villages grew into towns with larger areas of influence which engaged in active trade. Later, the Parisii, from northern Gaul, also settled down in the region of modern-day Yorkshire. Some of those ancient Celtic tongues have endured until the present day, including the Goidelic languages, such as Scottish Gaelic, Irish Gaelic and Mannish Gaelic, spoken in the Isle of Man. This Gaelic language originated in Ireland, but the Scotai extended it to Scotland around the 5th century. And then we have the Briton languages like Welsh, Cumbric, spoken in Cumbria, Briton, spoken by the Britons, who would later emigrate to French Brittany after the Anglo-Saxon invasions, and lastly Cornish, still spoken in Cornwall by about 3,000 people.
You speak my language.
This Britannic prosperity attracted the interest of the Roman Republic. Julius Caesar was fully embroiled in the Gallic Wars when he decided it would be a great idea to visit those rich Celts living in Britannia. He sent 2 expeditions, one in 55 BCE and another one the following year. In this last one, Caesar fought the Britannic tribe of the Catavaluni, led by Cassivellaunus, the first Briton known to history. Cassivellaunus lost that encounter, but Caesar had to return to Gaul to deal with the betrayal of Commius, leader of the Atrebates, a Gallic Belgian tribe who had changed sides to support his enemy, the leader of the Gallic resistance, Vercingetorix. If you remember your Roman history, you'll know that Caesar was eventually victorious, but that war quelled his interest in Britannia, and instead he returned to Rome to start a civil war against Pompey.
Like little children, always fighting.
However, Commius and his Atrebates migrated to Britannia and settled down there, founding a little kingdom of their own. It would take a whole century before the Romans decided to return, but when they eventually did, they did so in force, invading and conquering Britannia. In the year 27 BCE, Augustus became the first emperor of the Roman Empire and planned to invade Britannia on up to 3 occasions, but for one reason or another, he was never able to begin his conquest. Rome had allied with the Trinovantes tribe, but in the year 9 AD, capitalising on the Roman defeat at Teutoburg Forest, the Cativellauni, led by their king Cunobeline, started a war and managed to corner them. King Cunobeline was succeeded by his son Togodumnus, and under his rule the Cativellauni became the most powerful kingdom in southern Britannia. By the way, Britannia became the name of the territory occupied by the Romans, as opposed to Caledonia, formidable northern territory which later became known as Scotland. The Celts who lived there were known as Britons. The Romans also called Great Britain Albion, and the island of Ireland was called Hibernia for the local tribe of the Iverni. Both islands formed the Britannic Isles. Confused? Yes.
Oh, thank you for the geography lesson.
In the year 43 AD, the Romans were still allied with the Trinovantes and later started to connect with Verica, king of the Atrebates. This Verica fought Togodumnus and his brother Caractacus, but was defeated and had to flee Britannia with his tail between his legs. Now, all this is relevant because the Roman Emperor Claudius took advantage of the situation and, under the pretext of reinstating Verica as king, finally commenced the invasion of Britannia. Roman general Aulus Plautius first gained control over the territory of the Trinovantes and then went after the Cativellauni. Togodumnus sought to put up an anti-Roman resistance, but was killed at the Battle of the Thames and was then succeeded by his brother Caractacus. The final battle against the Cativellauni took place at their capital, Camulodunum, which is modern-day Colchester. After that big victory, many Briton tribes accepted the Roman rule, but not Caractacus, who fled and organised a new focus of resistance in the west. Meanwhile, the Romans settled their capital at Camulodunum and reinstated Verica as king of the Atrebates. After swearing fealty to Rome, of course.
I love Rome.
Over the following years, the Roman progress throughout the island was unstoppable. In the year 47 AD, the general and governor of Britannia, Osturius Scapula, led various attacks in Wales against the most powerful tribes, the Silures and the Ordovices, headed by Caractacus. In the year 50 AD, they were defeated at the Battle of Caer Caradoc, and Caractacus was forced to flee once again. This time he sought refuge with the tribe of the Brigantes, but their queen, Cartimandua, didn't want any trouble with the Romans and turned him in. It is said that Caractacus was put in chains and brought before the emperor, who then decided to be magnanimous and forgive him his life.
I own you.
In contrast, another queen in the area had no intention to befriend the Romans. Her name was Boudica, or Boadicea, ruler of the Iceni tribe, and she fought the invaders between the years 60 and 61 AD. The story goes that her anger came because the last will of her husband, King Prasutagus, left half of his territory to Emperor Nero, believing that this would buy them peace. Unfortunately, after he croaked, the Roman procurator of Britannia, Catus Decianus, decided to confiscate the whole lot and set extortionate taxes. Some things never change. And then to top it all off, he had Boudica flogged and allowed some of his entourage to have their way with her daughters.
All thieves, rapists, murderers, child molesters.
Boudica's rebellion was hugely successful. Many tribes joined the uprising, not only because she was the king's wife, but also a priestess of the war goddess Andraste. After gathering a massive army, Boudica managed to sack several Roman settlements, including Camulodunum and Londinium. However, a few months later, Roman general Gaius Suetonius Paulinus defeated her at the Battle of Watling Street, and Boudica, proud to the end, killed herself. Well, to be honest, nobody knows for sure what happened, and there are numerous theories about how she met her end: wounded in battle, drinking poison, falling sick, or Japanese-style seppuku. After this victory, the situation in southern Britannia calmed down considerably. The Romans began to Romanise the population. The small Celtic Britain kingdoms were gradually absorbed by the Roman administration, and Britannia became a province of the Roman Empire, with its capital at Camulodunum. New cities were founded and large architectural projects were developed, including aqueducts, pavements, bridges, sewer systems, public baths, and amphitheatres.
What have the Romans ever done for us?
The previously mentioned Londinium became the most important Roman city. Later it would be called London, and then eventually London. Without a doubt, this was the largest city and a hub of Briton-Roman trade. So much so that the Romans later made it the provincial capital. While Camulodunum continued to be important, it gradually lost its relevance in favour of other places like Calver, Silchester, Lindum, Lincoln, and Glevum, Gloucester. Another famous place was Aquae Sulis, thus called for its thermal waters, which made it a great place to build cool public baths. Small wonder then that nowadays it's called Bath. Lastly, the northernmost city was Eboracum, modern-day York. One governor we should mention was Julius Agricola, who conquered a lot of new territory until he reached Caledonia in the year 80 AD. There he encountered the fierce tribe of the Picts, over whom he triumphed at the Battle of Mons Graupius in 84 AD. But the land remained very rebellious and impossible to control. So much so that in 115 AD, the Picts overran the Roman garrison at Eboracum, which led Emperor Hadrian to order the construction of a massive defensive wall, the famous Hadrian's Wall.
Build that wall! Build that wall!
Its 118 kilometres represented a colossal construction project and, far more importantly, served as inspiration for the wall in Game of Thrones. But things didn't end there, because Hadrian's successor, Antoninus Pius, ordered the construction of a second wall further north, near the Fourth Clyde Isthmus. However, that project had to be abandoned, and so Hadrian's Wall stood as the real border between Roman Britannia and Caledonia.
Because England and Scotland share borders.
The next century was remarkably unremarkable. Well, except for when Emperor Septimus Severus tried to conquer the north in the year 211 AD, but instead ended up dying at Eboracum. Then, in 260 AD, all of Gaul and Britannia rose up against Rome, but this only lasted for 14 years. Between 286 and 296, we have the Revolt of Carausius. This Roman naval chief declared himself Emperor of Britannia and Northern Gaul. He managed to hold on for a decade, until he was defeated by Emperor and Tetrarch Constantius Chlorus, daddy of Constantine I. After that, the provinces were reorganised into Britannia Prima, Britannia Secunda, Flavia Caesarensis, and Maxima Caesarensis, and a little while later, the province of Valentia. In the following years, more Roman military leaders tried to gain control of Britannia. For example, the year 367 witnessed the Great Conspiracy, in which a garrison at Hadrian's Wall rebelled and let in the Picts, Attacossi and Scotti. By the way, these Attacossi and Scotti were two Gaelic tribes from Ireland who had begun to migrate into Caledonia and fight against the Picts. The Scotti would later lend their name to Scotland.
I give homage to Scotland.
With this, we reach the 5th century. In the year 407 AD, the Roman Empire was in a pretty bad shape due to the barbarian invasions by Germanic peoples. Faced with this threat, Emperor Constantine III recalled most of the troops from Britannia to fight in Gaul, and this was quickly noticed and just as quickly taken advantage of by some other Germanic invaders. These were mainly 3 tribes, Angles, Saxons and Jutes, who came from northern Germany and the Jutland Peninsula in Denmark. These are commonly known as the Anglo-Saxon Invasions. In 410 AD, the Romano-Britons asked Emperor Honorius for help, but he was already up to his neck in it, so he told them that they were going to have to help themselves. Therefore, that date marks the end of Roman Britannia and the start of Anglo-Saxon dominance, which gradually established 7 petty kingdoms, known as the Anglo-Saxon Heptarchy. This is the beginning of the fascinating history of medieval England.
Around the year 410, the Romans abandoned Britannia due to the Germanic invasions, as well as other internal problems afflicting the Western Roman Empire. That was when the British Isles entered a dark age, that is, a period for which there are very few primary sources. After the Roman retreat, the territory crumbled into multiple petty kingdoms, headed by a group of warring Britanno-Romans, many of them Christian. For example, the area around London was the Kingdom of Lundine. But the most important was the Kingdom of Dumnonia in the southwest, which comprised modern-day Cornwall, Devon and Somerset. In Wales, there was the Kingdom of Powys and the Kingdom of Gwynedd, which would later give rise to the Kingdom of, you guessed it, Wales. However, these kingdoms were rather weak, so they all disappeared when new invading hordes arrived, comprised by Angles, Saxons and Jutes from northern Germany and the Jutland Peninsula in Denmark. The first of the invaders to strike were the Jutes, led by the brothers Hengest and Horsa. They arrived on the coast of what is today Kent, and it appeared that they were initially hired as mercenaries by a Britannic leader named Vortigern to fight against the Pict and Irish invaders. The Jutes did the job, but in exchange they demanded a very high price and also the right to settle in the region. The Britons refused, and that was when the fighting started.
Fight!
The year 455 saw the Battle of Aylesford, although nobody is really sure who won it. According to the myth, Vortigern then sought to make peace with Hengist, and in turn, the Jute offered his daughter Rowena in marriage. But later, during a peace council, the Jutes pulled out their weapons and killed everybody they could get hold of.
Traitors. Murderers.
This is known as the Treason of the Long Knives, but it's not entirely clear if it really took place or not. According to the chronicles of Gildas the Wise, a guy I can only assume named himself, the Britons defended themselves under the orders of a leader named Ambrosius Aurelianus, whom the legend would later turn into the brother of Uther Pendragon and thus the uncle of King Arthur. Yes, that's right, that King Arthur.
I am Arthur, King of the Britons.
According to the tale, the Battle of Badon, or Mons Badonicus, took place around the year 500. This battle is famous because that was when the Britons managed to defeat the Anglo-Saxons and stop their advance throughout the island. The 9th century account, Historia Brittonum, says that a guy named Arthur commanded the Briton troops and kicked the Anglo-Saxons' arses.
Say hello to my little friend!
The problem was that very soon afterwards, the plague of Justinian ravaged the land, and the Britanno-Romans died in droves, while the Anglo-Saxons kept arriving in droves. Many of these Britanno-Romans decided to flee the island and move to the region of Armorica in Gaul, settling in what is known today as French Brittany. Some travelled even further south, to Hispania, to the modern-day region of Galicia. Sorry, Spanish viewers, I'm doing my best. Other groups of Britons simply shifted a little to the west, to Cumbria, Wales and Cornwall, moving in with other Britons who already lived there in order to hold out together. And lastly, there were some Britons who simply decided to stay in their land, accept the new Anglo-Saxon authority, and adapt to the culture of these new invaders.
You can either adapt and survive, or die with the past.
After the Jutes, it was the turn of the Saxons to occupy part of the island. They formed 3 kingdoms in the English south, which are easily recognisable today because they contain sex in their names, derived from Sax on, not because they were uncontrollably horny. Or maybe they were, who knows?
Sex. Where were we?
The first of these, the Kingdom of Sussex, or Southern Saxons, was founded in 490 by Æthelred. Later, around 519, King Cerdic created the Kingdom of Wessex, or Western Saxons, in what is today Hampshire, and it seems that he achieved this by killing a British king named Nathan Leod. Finally, we have the Kingdom of Essex, or Eastern Saxons, founded by King Aesquine. At this point, a third wave of invaders arrived, the Angles, who chose to settle down all over the central region. The first of their kingdoms was Lindsey, south of the Humber estuary. Soon afterwards, other Angles penetrated into the Midlands following the River Trent, where they initially formed the Kingdom of Icklingas, which would later become the Kingdom of Mercia. In the north, they founded 2 more kingdoms, Deira and Bernicia, which in time would merge into the Kingdom of Northumbria. And then the last Anglo-Saxon kingdom was East Anglia. These people spoke different dialects of Western Germanic, and their intermingling gave rise to Ancient English. For a perfect example, we need look no further than words like English and England, which evidently come from the term used to refer to the Angles.
I never thought of that.
During these troubled times, a large number of formerly Roman cities were abandoned, but one of the few that preserved part of its urban life was Londinium, which then became known as London and would later be called London. In any case, over time new cities were gradually built on top of the old Roman ruins, as in the case of Eorforwic, the capital of Northumbria, previously known as Eboracum and later as York, and also Wintoncestra, capital of Wessex, which we nowadays know as Winchester. In terms of their social organisation, the Anglo-Saxons didn't complicate themselves too much. At the cusp of their social hierarchy there was a king, or kinning. Next was a prince heir known as the Etheling, and then there were earls or dukes known as ealdormen. Last of all there were the barons or knights known as thanes, and these were the ones who fought for the king. There was also the Wittenagemot, or Witan, a kind of general assembly or council which periodically gathered all the wise men of the kingdom.
Spare us the theatrics! Behave yourself! Be a good boy, young man! Be a good boy!
The The age of post-Roman Britannia is a total frickin' mess, with precious few primary sources, so we are only going to review a simplified version of the most important points.
Let's just keep it simple.
After the year 560, Wessex was ruled by King Ceawlin, who is famous because he managed to expand his kingdom quite a bit following the Battle of Diorham in 577. He captured Glevum, Gloucester, Corinium, Cirencester, and Aquae Sulis, Bath, and even reached the Bristol Channel. Around the year 600, the Icklingas founded the Kingdom of Mercia. The exact date is not clear, and neither is the exact identity of the founder. Creoda, Piber, Searle, nobody really knows. But regardless, 601 was an important year for Christianity in the island, since that was when King Æthelred of Kent was baptised, making him the first pagan Anglo-Saxon ruler to convert. Moreover, he gave permission to the missionary Augustine, sent by Pope Gregory I, to build a monastery of Canterbury in the capital city of the kingdom, which back then was called Cantwebur. From that moment onwards, the Anglo-Saxons gradually began to worship Christ, although for a long time their early Christianity mixed in some Germanic and Celtic pagan elements. For example, the festival period of Easter was thus named for the goddess of spring, Eostra, or Istra, or Ostara, and the days of the week also made reference to Germanic deities. Monday came from Mani, personification of the moon. Tuesday came from Tyr or Tyr, god of single combat. Wednesday came from Woden or Huodin, their version of Odin, god of war and wisdom. Thursday came from Thor, god of thunder. Friday came from Frigg or Freya, goddess of marriage and motherhood. Saturday came from Sieta, god of harvests. And Sunday came from Suna or Sol, personification of the sun.
Wow, a whole week!
Lastly, King Æthelbert was responsible for creating the Law of Æthelbert, the oldest set of laws written in a Germanic language. Soon afterwards, the King of Wessex, Cynegils, jumped on the new trend and also converted to Christianity. London became the episcopal seat, and the first church dedicated to St. Paul was built in the city. In the year 604, King Æthelfrith unified Bernicia and Deira and established his capital at Bamborough. Some refer to this union as Northumbria, but that name wouldn't be commonly used until quite a bit later.
But where is this place?
Æthelfrith was surrounded by enemies, namely the Britons of Gododin to the north, the Kingdom of Strathclyde to the west, and the Gallic Kingdom of Dalriata to the northwest. But Æthelfrith was a very brave, or very reckless man, so he fought against every single one of them, and between the years 613 and 616 he won a massive victory over the Welsh kingdoms of Powys and Ross at the Battle of Chester. With this, he managed to cut the land connection between Wales and Cumbria. However, soon afterwards he died fighting against Raedwald, King of East Anglia. Under his protection was Edwin, the exiled son of King Aella, founder of Deira, who, after the deaths of Æthelbert and Æthelthryth, found it relatively simple to lay a claim over Bernicia and Deira. He just needed to marry Æthelbert, the Princess of Kent, and in order to do that he had to convert to Christianity, which he had no trouble doing in 627.
Amen.
This unification and conversion did not go down very well at all with Edwin's neighbour, King Penda of Mercia, since he was extremely pagan and hated all this new Christianity business. So, Penda allied with the Welsh king of Gwenod, Cadwallon ap Cadfan, and together they defeated and killed both Edwin and his son at the Battle of Hatfield Chase in 633. Then, seeing as he was on a roll, the Welsh king decided to carry on fighting and take over the whole region. But a year later, in 634, Oswald, the exiled son of Æthelfrith, defeated him at Heavenfield and became the king of Bernicia. The main thing to point out from his reign is the work of another man, the Irish monk Aidan, who built lots of monasteries, churches and schools, like the one at Lindisfarne, which became one of the main centres for the dissemination of Christianity throughout England.
I would advise every single one of them to convert to Christianity immediately.
In the year 642, King Penda of Mercia counterattacked and killed Oswald at the Battle of Mayserfield, chopping his body into pieces and displaying them on poles. Lovely. Oswald's brother Oswy did not appreciate this and set out to get revenge. He eventually achieved it in 655 with a great victory over the Mercians at the Battle of the River Wynwad. Despite commanding a superior force, King Penda was killed at that battle, and this allowed Oswy to unify the kingdom under the name of Northumbria. After defeating Mercia, Oswy placed on the throne Peda, the son of Penda, because he was Christian, thus marking the conversion of the last pagan kingdom.
Better the devil you know than the pagans you don't.
Everything seemed to be going hunky-dory for the old Jesus religion, but unfortunately the different English Christian churches did not manage to agree on certain issues, like the date or whether to celebrate Easter, for example. For this reason, in the year 664, King Oswey held the Synod of Whitby, where many Christian religious figures gathered at Whitby Abbey to decide whether to adopt the Roman or Irish rites. Eventually the Roman option was chosen, and this unification of the church was very important because it was the seed from which to create a common language and culture, which in turn contributed to the future unification of all England. By the year 660, all the kingdoms of the so-called Anglo-Saxon Heptarchy were already well consolidated. These were Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex and Wessex.
England!
In this regard, we must mention Sutton Hoo, a site in East Anglia where an ancient ship burial was discovered, which contained a wealth of historical artefacts in the tomb of an unknown figure, probably King Radwald of the East Angles. This finding is very important because, up until then, historians had believed that the Anglo-Saxons were rather rudimentary and even decadent, but it turned out that their society was far more sophisticated than previously thought. Or at least their nobility was, since they had rich weapons, high-quality ornaments, and an extensive commercial network, as evidenced by the goods found in that grave, which included Franc coins, Byzantine trinkets, and even silk from Syria.
Well, I must say that Prince John has spared no expense for tonight's party.
At that time, Northumbria was the most successful kingdom, and its ruler, Ecgfrith, son of Oswey, got cocky and decided to invade Scotland. Naturally, this met with the objections of the local tribe of Picts, led by their king, Bridie MacBill. Their disagreement came to a head in 685 at the Battle of Dunnectan, where the Picts drew the Northumbrian invaders to a swamp, where they massacred almost all of them, including King Ecgfrith. This defeat severely weakened the Kingdom of Northumbria, and this was taken advantage of by their neighbours in Mercia, who began a period of great expansion to the point that the Mercian king, Æthelred I, managed to take over the south of Northumbria in 679, after the Battle of the River Trent. Over the following century, Northumbria would be distracted by constant squabbling between its kings and nobles. Meanwhile, further south, King In of Wessex defeated the Britons of the Kingdom of Dumnonia around 710, and thus vanquished it forever. He then built several monasteries and churches, and also created a legal code, the Law of In. However, after he abdicated in 726 to go on a pilgrimage to Rome, what a nerd,
being king is exhausting.
Leaving no obvious heir, Wessex was left at the mercy of their powerful neighbours of Mercia. In fact, around 730, under King Ethelbald, Mercia dominated all the other kingdoms in southern England, or at least most of them, including Wessex over intermittent periods. One of his successors was King Offa, and with him Mercia reached its maximum splendour. During his reign he maintained control over southern England, while Sussex, Kent and East Anglia ended up without a king. Well, it's more that those kings ended up without a head.
What's in the box?
It appears that even the Kingdom of Wessex was subject to Mercia, following the death of King Cynewulf. Offa also got into plenty of scuffles with the Welsh Kingdom of Powys, and is famous for building a very long canal and embankments that would serve as a border between England and Wales, which came to be known as Offa's Dyke. Because of this separation, the Anglo-Saxon and Welsh cultures gradually became more distanced and different with the passage of time.
Same genus, different species.
Offa also reformed the economy and introduced pennies, a new currency that persists to this day. Under his leadership, the capital of Mercia was established at the town of Tamworth, located very near modern-day Birmingham. Another city controlled by Mercia was Lincoln, which back then was known as Lincyleen, and had evolved from the Roman settlement of Lindum Colonia. But then, as if these 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms didn't have enough chaos raging all by themselves, some new enemies appeared: the Vikings. The 8th of June 793 marked the start of the Viking Age, with their attack on the monastery of Lindisfarne in Northumbria.
It's the Viking Age.
This would be the first in a series of raids that would completely redraw the island's political landscape, and which we will see in the next episode of this series. We pick up this story in the same place we left it at the end of the last episode, the sacking of Lindisfarne Monastery by the Vikings. Although this was not their first attack on record, it is the one that marks the start of the invasion of Anglo-Saxon lands by these Scandinavian peoples. Throughout the following years, this situation would be repeated over and over again. The Vikings would arrive with no prior warning, raid monasteries and coastal towns, take anything of value, kidnap or kill everyone they came across, and then disappear as fast as they came.
They are some sneaky bastards.
But what were the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms doing while all these attacks took place? Well, when we last saw them, the Kingdom of Mercia, under King Coenwulf, controlled all the central and southern parts, while Northumbria, led by King Æthelred, held sway over the north. But this precarious balance of power, which had been pretty shaky even at the best of times, was starting to fall apart, and so the Anglo-Saxons were quite busy with their own internal squabbles. The year 825 brought the end of Mercia's supremacy, marked by the Battle of Ellendun, at which the Mercian troops of Beornwulf were defeated by the army of Wessex, led by King Ecgbert. This king is very important from a historical standpoint, as he is considered to be the founding member of the current British royal family. Can you see the resemblance?
Identical.
Under him, Wessex was reborn and went on to conquer Mercia for many years, as well as Essex, Sussex and Kent definitively. He even took over Cornwall, and thanks to all these conquests, Wessex became the most powerful kingdom in England. Now let's have a quick look at the state of the other British nations. First we'll travel north to sunny Scotland, where the fierce Picts dominated most of the land through a confederation known as Fortru. That is, until the arrival of a guy named Kenneth MacAlpin, but better known as Kenneth. He was the ruler of Dal Riata, a small Goidelic kingdom of the Scotai tribe, located in the Hebrides, an archipelago off the western coast of Scotland. King Kenneth went on a conquering spree and ended up taking over most of Scotland, founding the Kingdom of Alapa in 843, which soon afterwards would become the Kingdom of Scotland. In fact, the Scottish people generally consider Kenneth as the first King of Scotland.
Scotland?
Meanwhile, farther south, the territory of Wales was divided into several petty kingdoms. That means small, not pedantic. Here we must highlight the role of King Rhodri the Great, ruler of Gwynedd and Powys, who would later proclaim himself King of all Britons when he expelled the Vikings from his domains. After his death, his kingdom was divided among his children, of whom the best known was Anardwood, heir of Gwynedd.
But where is this place?
Back in England, King Ecgbert of Wessex died in 839 and was succeeded by his son Æthelwulf, who had to defend the land against periodic Viking attacks but managed to keep them more or less in check. King Æthelwulf in turn was succeeded by his own children, and yes, that's children in plural. First was Æthelbald, who died after just 2 years and had barely enough time to marry his own stepmother, but not enough time to have any heirs. Therefore, the crown went to his brother Ethelbert, but he didn't last very long either, just 5 years, and was also childless.
Being king is exhausting.
So finally it was the turn of the third brother, Æthelred I, who managed not to die so quickly and became quite an important figure, but we'll come back to him later. First, we need to get up to speed with the other side of the brewing conflict, the Vikings, who had been conducting increasingly violent raids until, in 865, they finally decided to get down to serious business and prepare a large-scale invasion with the goal of relocating to England from their Danish homeland. This force was known as the Great Heathen Army and was led by the brothers Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson, both sons of the semi-legendary Ragnar Lodbrok. They were also accompanied by their sibling Ubba, and, according to the Nordic sagas, there was also Bjorn, Ragnar's eldest son. Sort of like a little family holiday, really. Lovely. Now, be warned that from this point onward there are going to be plenty of spoilers for the series Vikings and the Last Kingdom, and we don't want to start getting hate mail because we ruined the fun. We're not the Crown. But we will be happy if you tell us what you think of this video in the comments. We read them all. Back to our story. The massive Viking army disembarked in East Anglia and offered a deal to its king, Edmund. He would provide the Vikings with horses, and in exchange he would get to keep his head. King Edmund was quite attached to his head, so he accepted the deal, and Ivar and Ubba marched the army north towards Northumbria, seeking to topple its rulers, who at that time were two kings, Osbert and Aela, squabbling over the land. In the year 866, the Vikings conquered the city of Iorforwic, or York, and this was the beginning of the Kingdom of Jorvik, derived from their name for York, where they placed Ecgbert I as a puppet ruler, and not a fun puppet like Kermit, but a bad puppet like those ones from the Dark Crystal. That finally got the attention of kings Osbert and Aela, who combined their armies to try and retake the city. Unfortunately, by that time it was too little too late, and both kings were swiftly defeated, captured, and, as you can probably imagine, I mean we're talking about the Vikings here, executed.
They're not human, they're brutal.
But in fact, this wasn't just another normal Viking killing, this was personal. You see, the reason why the brothers Halfdan and Ivar wanted to attack Northumbria in the first place was to get revenge against King Aelle, because he was supposed to have killed their dad, that semi-mythical Ragnar Lodbrok, several years earlier by casting him into a pit of vipers. Cool. And a bloody revenge they certainly took. According to some accounts, Aelle suffered a form of torture called the Blood Eagle, whereby his ribs were severed from the spine with a knife and then his lungs were pulled through the opening to create a pair of wings. Again, Vikings.
That sounds awful.
This is a reconstruction of what ancient York looked like back then, according to Assassin's Creed Valhalla. In it we can see the ruins of the Roman theatre, the royal hall where the king lived, the Multanglia Tower, or rather what was left of it from Roman times when it was part of a fortress, and of course York Cathedral, built around the year 750, after the previous one burned down. By the way, a big thank you to Marcelo Rojas, who captured these sequences for us.
You're the best.
Over time, the Viking settlements in this region began to prosper, and eventually the Anglo-Saxons and Danes intermixed quite a bit, both genetically and linguistically. In fact, many modern English words come from Old Norse and Danish, including egg, knife, husband, and fog. The cities of York, Lincoln, and Norwich became big centres of trade, and their commercial links extended through the Baltic Sea, reaching all the way to Kievan Rus. And now for a brief and unusual side note. What you see here is the Lloyds Bank Coprolite. If you're thinking, what's that piece of shit? Well, it's exactly that. The largest sample of fossilised human excrement ever found. It was unearthed in York and is thought to have been produced around this time, but that is not certain. Nobody volunteered to carbon date it. It's a whopping 20 centimetres long, nearly 8 inches, so it's safe to say that the Viking who produced it must have felt very relieved afterwards.
I have famously huge turds.
And now let's put that crap behind us, see what I did there, and get back to the story. The neighbouring kingdom of Bamborough, with its capital at the city of the same name, managed to maintain its independence to a certain extent, but at the cost of paying a tribute to the Vikings. Back then, this payment in exchange for peace and safety was called the Danegeld. Nowadays we call it extortion, or taxes, depending on who's doing it. At that time, the Danes of the Great Heathen Army began a series of campaigns to conquer all the Anglo-Saxon territory.
A mob of tired, hungry Vikings.
East Anglia was the first to fall in 869. It is told that Ivar and Ubba tortured King Edmund to make him renounce his Christian religion, but that he refused and so was eventually riddled with arrows and decapitated. After his death, East Anglia was controlled by the Vikings, who then proceeded to launch an attack on the kingdom of Mercia, ruled by King Burgred. They took the city of Nottingham quite easily, and since they were doing so well, told their friends back home to come join the party. That was when a new Viking horde arrived, the Great Summer Army, commanded by Bagsec. This force joined the previous heathen troops, and together they took over a large part of Mercia, where they placed the puppet king Ceolwulf II in charge. If you've seen The Last Kingdom, it's this old geezer here who's about to conquer it. At this point, the Danes began to set their sights on the biggest prize around, which was Wessex, and this is where these two powerful sides clashed, as the invaders came up against a fierce resistance, led by the ruler of Wessex we mentioned earlier, King Æthelred I. He gained some initial victories, like the Battle of Ashdown in 871, where his younger brother Alfred helped him to defeat the Great Heathen Army, headed by Halfdan and Bagsec, with the latter dying on the battlefield. Still, after having a great run, it seems that the Saxon king was wounded, fighting against Halfdan at the Battle of Meriton, and he eventually died from these wounds. Or maybe from something else, it's not very clear.
All good things must come to an end.
Regardless, the key point is that his son Ethelwald did not succeed him as king, because he was still a small boy, not like in the TV series where he is depicted as a young drunkard. Instead, the crown went to Aethelred's brother Alfred, who later became known as Alfred the Great. Alfred the Great became King of Wessex in 871. His main headache was still the great heathen army, so he decided to literally buy some time, paying them to leave Wessex alone and go and harass someone else instead. The Vikings took Alfred's money and went on to attack what was left of Mercia. They had managed to take over the eastern part of the kingdom, and there they created some Viking settlements, the 5 boroughs of the Danelaw: Lincoln, Stanford, Nottingham, Derby, and Leicester. After this, the great heathen army split into two. Halfdan travelled north, where he was crowned as the first Viking ruler of the region, which up until then had been known as Northumbria and thereafter as Jorvik. But while the name of the region may have changed, the neighbouring enemies were still the same, so Halfdan spent most of his time fighting against the Picts, Scotai and the Britons of Strathclyde, until he died shortly afterwards, during an internal conflict between two Viking factions. What happened was that Halfdan wanted to travel to Dublin to be crowned as King of Ireland as well, but the local Vikings living there objected to his plan, and so they resolved the dispute Viking style at the Battle of Strangford Lough, where Halfdan was killed.
We're Vikings, we don't run from a fight.
Meanwhile, the remaining half of the heathen army, led by Guthrum, controlled the southern part of the Danish territory right next to Wessex. Inevitably, these two forces ended up clashing, specifically at the Battle of Wareham in 876, where the Vikings were victorious. Alfred the Great of Wessex began to lose territory little by little, but he also had some victories, like at the Battle of Kinwit in 878, where the Saxons managed to kill Ubba, the last remaining son of Ragnar. Then, on the 6th of January of the year 878, while the court of Wessex was at Chippenham, perhaps drunkenly celebrating Epiphany, Guthrum and his Vikings launched a surprise attack. King Alfred managed to escape miraculously and take refuge in the marshes of the region of Somerset, specifically in a tiny village called Athelney. From this new base, Alfred began to recruit an army among the population to keep fighting the Vikings. He then launched a fierce attack which resulted in the Battle of Eddington, or Ethandun, of 878, where Alfred won a great victory. The Vikings ran back to their fortresses to regroup, but Alfred followed them and laid siege to it, and after 2 weeks they had to surrender. The defeated Guthrum was brought before Alfred the Great and forced to accept defeat, make peace and convert to Christianity, taking the new name Athelstan. The Treaty of Wedmore also set out the new border that would separate Wessex from the Viking territories, which were named Danelaw, the land under Danish law.
It's a clever name.
But Alfred knew that this peace was just a temporary situation, so he focused on preparing the Kingdom of Wessex for possible future wars, creating a part-time army, the Third, building a fleet and constructing almost 30 walled citadels known as burhs. Here we can see a map showing the burhs that were built during this period. Some of the most important were the one at Hastings in the southern region, and the one at Portchester, which was close by. We also have the burhs of Exeter in modern-day Devon, and Worcester near the Welsh border. Oxford also had a fortress, which would later leave its place to the famous university, and nearby, between Oxford and London, was the fort of Aylesbury, which was the capital of the Mercians led by Æthelred II, subject and son-in-law of Alfred, who we will talk about in a minute. Other notable forts were the one at Eashing in the southern part of Wessex, and also the one at Buckingham, nothing to do with the royal palace of the current rulers. Lastly, there was another important burh in Southwark in the south part of London, a city which, incidentally, was conquered by Alfred in 886 and renamed Londonburg. After the conquest, the city was reformed, particularly the defensive walls, and began to rise in importance, eventually becoming the modern capital of the country. This conquest went to Alfred's head, and he proclaimed himself king of all Anglo-Saxons.
It's a meaningless title.
As a side note, one small detail that bothers me from this reconstruction of the city, created for Assassin's Creed Valhalla that you are seeing now, is that massive aqueduct dividing the city, since as far as I know, it never existed. Other similar reconstructions we have shown previously definitely don't feature it. What they do feature is the Great Roman Amphitheatre, next to Cripplegate Ward and Gate. Moving towards the city centre, we find the Old Roman Forum, which at that time was used as a market. And moving south on the banks of the River Thames, we find the Governor's House, which later became the residence of the city's rulers. The game features a cool mission in which we have to investigate the murder of one such governor inside the palace. We also have the Temple of Sulis Minerva and the town of Londonwig, in what today is Covent Garden, where it seems there was a notable church or abbey. Lastly, further south, we have Westminster, the future site of the British Parliament and Buckingham Palace. Another very important city back then was Winchester, previously known as Venta Belgarum, which was the political heart of the kingdom and thus housed the residence of the King of Wessex. Here we must highlight Old Minster Church, built some centuries earlier in 660 by King Kenwell. During this time it was converted into a sumptuous cathedral where several Wessex monarchs were buried. Naturally, King Alfred lived in a palace, well, like a king, but unfortunately we have no idea what it looked like. The existing records only say that it was luxurious. It appears that sometime later, around 901, a new cathedral was built right next door, and so that one was called New Minster. And then we have Nunnaminster, or St Mary's Abbey, a Benedictine nunnery which is also featured in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, even though the game is supposed to take place before it was built. Lastly, it is worth mentioning the Lockburn, a drainage and sewer system that still exists and remarkably was in operation until the 19th century. Now let's get back to the action. After an interregnum, during which the land of Jorvik was kingless for 6 years, Guthred took the throne in 883. He featured prominently in the second season of The Last Kingdom, where he is shown to be Christian, but the truth is that nobody really knows for certain. In fact, very little is known for certain about this guy. A few years later, in 886, Æthelred II became ruler of Mercia and married Princess Æthelflaed of Wessex, the daughter of Alfred the Great and his wife Elswith. And this meant that the kingdom of Mercia, which had been in steady decline for a while, became subject to Wessex.
I own you.
Æthelred and Æthelflaed had a daughter, Elfwin, who is considered to be the last ruler of Mercia. This was mainly thanks to King Alfred, who was a deft statesman and dedicated considerable effort to combining the institutions and legal codes of both territories in order to unify the kingdom. After the year 891, new waves of Norse invaders began to arrive in England. One of these groups was led by the famous Viking Hastin, who fought several battles against Wessex, including the Battle of Farnham in 893. But Alfred had established strong defences that broke up the Viking army, and the invaders were pushed east to Essex. Eventually, the remainders of that force returned home in 896, or became integrated into the Danelaw.
We kicked your asses!
Now that Wessex finally appeared to be secure, Alfred the Great dedicated the last years of his life to culture. He founded schools and filled his court with erudite men from all over the land who translated important works and also wrote the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a collection of annals detailing the history of the first English kings. Alfred the Great eventually passed away in 899 and was succeeded by his son, Edward the Elder. Now, it's not that he was like Benjamin Button. Back then Edward was a young man and the elder bit came many years later. In any case, what we need to know is that his reign got off to a rocky start because his cousin, Athelwold, son of Æthelred I, the elder brother of Alfred the Great, tried to claim the throne after the death of his uncle, and conquered the symbolically important estate of Winbourne in Dorset. Edward marched there with his army and challenged him to settle a problem man to man, but his cousin, who had previously declared that he would live or die at Winbourne, soiled himself and fled in the middle of the night, seeking the protection of the Danish king Eric of East Anglia. Æthelwold and Eric then fought Edward at the Battle of the Home in 902. Although the Danes actually won the day, both Eric and Æthelwold died during the fight.
That sounds an awful lot like defeat.
This put an end to the family feud, but the Danelaw problem still remained. That led to the Battle of Tettenhall in 910, where Wessex and Mercia fought against the Viking kings of Northumbria, two guys known as Eowils and Halfdan. No, not Halfdan Ragnarsson, he was still dead. This was a different Halfdan. The Vikings lost the battle and their kings were killed, leaving a power vacuum in Northumbria, which was eventually filled by Irish Viking rulers. Edward then allied with his sister, Æthelflaed, now a widow and in single control of Mercia, and thus considered to be the first woman to fully rule an Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Together, the siblings began to take over some Danish lands, and by 913 they had conquered Essex. Then in 918, Æthelflaed died, and Edward annexed Mercia as well, including the Danish part, which had belonged to Æthelflaed's heir, his own niece, Elfwin. With this, all the land south of the Humber estuary became part of the Kingdom of Wessex. Perhaps the reason why King Edward wanted a lot of land was because he had a big family, including 3 wives and 14 children. And those are just the official ones, but you can be sure that there were plenty of illegitimate ones too.
How many women? How many children?
Some of the daughters he had with his second wife Æthelred were married off to other powerful European kings and nobles, while 3 of his sons became kings, of which the most important was his firstborn Athelstan. More about him in a minute. Before that, we need to talk about a significant event which took place in 911. Over on the mainland, the Frankish kings were also fed up of suffering constant Viking raids, so King Charles the Simple of West Francia made a deal with a Viking chief named Rollo. In exchange for loyalty and protection, Charles named him Duke of a region in the northern part. Rollo was also made to convert to Christianity and marry Gisela, a possibly illegitimate daughter of King Charles, and thus began the first dynasty of Normans, or Northern Men, who later lent their name to the region of Normandy, which will come up in future episodes. For now, all you need to know is that these Vikings adapted very quickly to the culture of West Francia, started to speak ancient French, and became Christians.
I would advise every single one of them to convert to Christianity immediately.
From the year 920, we must highlight the Welsh king Hwylvar, or Howell the Good, who unified the 2 petty kingdoms of Dafod and Cysechel to create the new kingdom of Deheubarth. Despite being a bellicose guy, Howell managed to maintain good relations with Wessex and also created an important set of laws.
I am the law.
Meanwhile, Edward the Elder passed away in the year 924 and was succeeded by his son Athelstan, who we mentioned earlier. This king married off his sister Edith to the Danelaw king, Sihtric, to seal a non-aggression pact. But then Sihtric died in 927 and Athelstan wasted no time in conquering the city of York. Amazingly, in a matter of months, he was able to annex all the former Viking lands and take over Danelaw.
That's unbelievable! Unbelievable!
To celebrate his accomplishment, Athelstan stopped using the title of King of the Anglo-Saxons and instead proclaimed himself King of the English. This was the birth of the Kingdom of England. In the year 927, King Athelstan became ruler of all England after conquering the Kingdom of Jorvik. He then defeated the King of Scotland, Strathclyde, and the Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of Bamborough. Even the Welsh monarchs paid him an annual tribute and recognised Athelstan as their overlord, and to this day the Welsh absolutely love being ruled over by the English.
You were being sarcastic.
This first king of the English devoted significant efforts to improving the administration and laws governing the country. He reorganised the entire territory into shires, each headed by an ealdorman. These counties in turn were divided into districts or hundreds, and those contained the towns or cities. Everything seemed to be going just hunky-dory for the Anglo-Saxons, except for the fact that there still remained many Nordic people living in the country, and they quite fancied regaining control of their former territories. So, the faction of those Nordics who had settled in Dublin, led by Olaf Guthrisson, allied with the Britons of the Kingdom of Strathclyde and King Constantine II of Scotland, or the Kingdom of Alba, and that's when the shit hit the fan, leading to the Battle of Bruenburh in 937. Athelstan and his brother Edmund fought the coalition and squashed it, thus regaining control over all of Northumbria. In addition, this battle proved a catalyst that united the royalties of Wessex and Mercia against a common enemy. 2 years later, Athelstan died single and childless, so his brother Edmund the Magnificent took the crown. During his reign, the Danes, headed by Olaf Guthrisson, took back the Kingdom of Jorvik, but they didn't manage to establish their control very firmly, and by 944, Edmund had reconquered it.
Mine.
After Edmund came the third sibling, Æthelred, who is famous for his fight against the Norwegian king Eric Bloodaxe. Well, actually he wasn't a king anymore because he was so violent and bloodthirsty, even for a Viking, which is saying something, that he was run out of Norway. This piece of work ended up in Northumbria, and by about 947 he had taken control of the territory. King Æthelred went over there, defeated him, sent him back the way he came, and thought that would be the end of it, but Eric was a hard man to get rid of. A few years later, in 952, he returned and again managed to take over the English north.
Well, it's Groundhog Day.
Which he ruled for 2 years, until the Northumbrians also got fed up with his wicked ways and kicked him out. The key point here is that all of the Northumbrian territory, which included the Kingdom of Jorvik, was then definitively incorporated into England. The following English king was Eadwig Allfair, son of Edmund, who was more interested in skirt affairs than state affairs, if you know what I mean. In fact, according to the legend, King Eadwig's salacious escapades began right from the day of his coronation. The rumour goes that, at one point during the celebrations, the king disappeared, and so Dunstan, Abbot of Glastonbury, went looking everywhere for him. It took a while, but eventually he found His Royal Highness in bed, playing Hide the Sceptre with a noble lady named Elfgafu, and also her mother, Æthelgafu. As you can see, the tabloid-worthy affairs of British royalty go way back. Anyway, Dunstan first dressed down the king and then made him get dressed up and attend the banquet, but Elfgafu's mother never forgave the abbot for interrupting their private coronation. She kept plotting against him and eventually managed to get him exiled from the kingdom for a few years, until the king passed away in 959. The crown then went to Edgar the Peaceful, and his reign was just that, peaceful. He spent a lot of money rebuilding old monasteries and constructing new ones, and supported the Benedictine reform. He ensured that the clergy received excellent training, and so it's not surprising that many bishops and monks later became part of the Witan, or Wittengemot, or Royal Council of English Royalty. Edgar died in 975 and was succeeded by his 2 children. First was Edward the Martyr, who only lasted 3 years. Apparently he was a very violent man and attracted much hate, and perhaps that's why he was assassinated by supporters of his 10-year-old half-brother Æthelred II, or Æthelred the Unready, who thus became the new king. Æthelred the Unready ruled for more than 30 years, but with a name like that you can probably guess that he wasn't a great monarch. In fact, he is generally considered to be one of the most disastrous kings in English history, even more disastrous than Frederick the Fuck-Up. Okay, I just made that one up.
Cheeky.
Let's have a look at this period so you can understand why this was such an unfortunate time for the Anglo-Saxons. First of all, we must travel to Denmark, to the domains of King Harold Gormson, better known as Harold Bluetooth, whom the wireless technology was named after. King Harold had a grand vision of imposing Christianity throughout his kingdom, but it didn't turn out quite the way he hoped, because his own son, Swyn Forkbeard, was totally against the idea, to the point that he killed his father and took the throne in 986. The supporters of dead King Harold fled to England, and there they fought against King Æthelred II with remarkable success. So much so that the news reached Selwyn, who then decided that killing Englishmen sounded like his kind of party, and off he went with his army. This led to the Battle of Maldon in 991, which ended with a great victory for the Viking invaders, commanded by Olaf Tryggvason, ally of Selwyn and future King of Norway. It also marked the last time that anything exciting happened in Maldon.
Ouch.
From here onwards, the English forces fell like dominoes. The system of defensive boroughs failed, lacking adequate support from the inept Anglo-Saxon king Æthelred, who basically just hid away like a proper coward. When the situation became critical, Æthelred tried to pay the Scandinavians to leave him alone, but this strategy achieved the exact opposite, as it made the invaders greedy for more gold, and the fighting soon resumed. To make things worse, the Vikings obtained the support of the Normans, who allowed them to operate from their ports in northern France. In an attempt to break up this alliance, in the year 1001, Æthelred II married Princess Emma, sister to Richard II, Duke of Normandy. This was the start of a closer relationship between the English and the Norman crowns, which, as we mentioned in the previous episode, would later become central to future events. Then, in 1002, King Æthelred II was told that the Danes living in England were plotting to assassinate him, and so he ordered them all to be killed. The result was a complete bloodbath, which has come to be known as the St. Brice Day Massacre, and in which Sewin Forkbeard's own sister was also murdered. This infuriated the Danish king, who retaliated with a new raid.
See, now you made him mad!
In 1003, Sewin's troops disembarked at East Anglia, and although they were initially defeated at the walls of Thetford, the Danish onslaught continued over the following years. The English tried to build a fleet to fight them on the seas, but half of it, commanded by a nobleman called Wulfnoth Killed, deserted and began sacking coastal villages. And then when the other half of the fleet went to chase them, it ended up being destroyed by a storm. Basically, it was a total shit show. Seeing this mess, Sewin Forkbeard realised that England was even weaker than he had imagined, and so he decided to mount a full-scale invasion. In 1013, a new Danish fleet arrived at Kent, and city after city fell or surrendered to the Vikings. They took Northumbria, the 5 old boroughs of the Danelaw, Oxford, Winchester, and eventually reached the gates of London.
They're in London.
London, okay.
The Anglo-Saxons were sensible and surrendered the city, whereupon Æthelred II fled to Normandy with his children, Edward and Alfred, leaving the Danes in control of England for a turbulent period of 30 years. But before we start delving into that, remember that we live for your subscriptions, likes, comments and shares. King Sewin Forkbeard wasn't able to enjoy his great conquest for very long, because he died at his camp in Gainsborough in 1014. His son Harold II took over the Danish throne, while his younger brother, Canute II, or Canute the Great, continued Sweyn's invasion and was even proclaimed as King of England by the Danish troops living in Northumbria. Among other things, Canute is famous for his formidable personal guard, a corps of about 2,000 badass warriors wielding enormous battle axes known as the housecarls. Meanwhile, over in northern France, Æthelred II hadn't given up on reclaiming his throne. He obtained the support of the Witan, returned to England and fought Canute. However, several English nobles who saw the writing on the wall decided to join the Danish side, and this shifted the tide until Æthelred was forced to retreat to London. The city was besieged, and there he died, mostly alone, and was buried at Old St. Paul's Cathedral. But Æthelred's death was not the end of this mess, as his son Edmund II, or Edmund Ironside, kept it going with the support of allies like Uhtred the Bold, Earl of Bamborough. As an interesting aside, one of the protagonists of the series The Last Kingdom is mostly based on him. It is thought that Uhtred travelled to see Canute with the intention of joining him, but he was assassinated on the way there. Nobody really knows by who.
It was an accident.
By this point, the English defenders were completely unable to stop the Danish advance. The city of London was surrounded, and although Edmund Ironside managed to escape and fight another day, he was eventually defeated at the Battle of Assendun in 1016, after which he agreed to split up the country. King Edmund would keep Wessex, while Canute would have the rest of England north of the Thames. And so they lived happily ever... no, just kidding. Edmund appeared dead mysteriously a few weeks later, and the Witan elected Canute the Great, King of all England. Not that they really had much choice. Canute then made 2 classic moves of any new foreign king. First, he converted to the local religion, in this case Christianity, and then he married the widow of the former king, in this case Emma of Normandy, seeking to legitimise the throne for his descendants. Later, when his brother Harold II died in 1018, Canute also inherited Denmark, and it seems that the guy preferred his homeland, so he gradually paid less and less attention to England. The territory became divided into 4 counties: Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria and East Anglia, whose rulers, or ealdorman, came to be known just as earls, which incidentally comes from the Scandinavian term jarl, meaning chieftain. These titles were given to nobles with Danish roots, except in the case of Wessex, where it went to a Saxon named Godwin. Remember Wulfnoth Killed, the naval commander we mentioned earlier who rebelled and took half of the English fleet? Well, this was his son, who became a very powerful earl and will soon feature prominently in this story.
Oh, he's gonna get in trouble!
In the year 1027, Canute went to war against Norway and Sweden and conquered a large part of those kingdoms. As you can see on this map, he was a lord of a huge domain. But then Canute died in 1035, and that set off the first of multiple succession free-for-alls. If you recall, Canute had married Æthelred's widow, Emma of Normandy, who bore him a child named Canute III, or Harthacnut. However, it turned out that the cheeky Canute had also fathered another son with a Danish lass called Elskafu, a boy known as Harold Harefoot, and upon Canute's death, while Harthacnut was tied up dealing with the revolt in their Scandinavian homeland, this Harold made a play for the English throne. Around the same time, Alfred, the exiled son of Emma and Æthelred II, arrived in England from Normandy to visit his mother and was promptly assassinated by order of Earl Godwin because he suspected that Alfred would stir up trouble seeking to claim the crown or something like that. Soon afterwards, in 1040, Harold Harefoot fell ill and died, leaving the path to the English throne clear for his half-brother and legitimate heir, Harthacnut, who turned out to be a very unpopular king because he set extortionate taxes. Fortunately, he didn't last very long either, as he died just a couple of years later in 1042 after getting lethally drunk during a banquet. Up in the north, the kingdom of Alapa was ruled by a lad named Macbeth. He would serve as inspiration for Shakespeare's play, which is quite historically inaccurate. Macbeth reached the throne after having Duncan I, his predecessor, killed, and he also fought against Siward, Earl of Northumbria, when he attempted to invade Scotland. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of England in northern France, there was a Duchy of Normandy, where Duke Robert I lived happily at his castle of Falaise. It appears that he maintained a romance with a young commoner named Herlever, who bore him a son, and although they probably called the boy William, he is generally known to history as William the Conqueror, or William the Bastard, depending on who you ask.
We're the same person.
Then, in 1035, Robert travelled to Jerusalem, but unfortunately he died on his way back, making William the new Duke of Normandy. His initial years were full of intrigue and murders, including a conspiracy plotted by his very own cousin, Guy of Burgundy, Count of Brionne. William was forced to flee Normandy and ended up seeking refuge at the court of the French king, Henry I, who became his protector and overlord, and later helped him to reclaim his duchy after they triumphed at the Battle of Verlédon. William then settled at Caen, where he built himself a castle and, for a short while, lived peacefully with his wife, Matilda of Flanders. However, his life would soon take a turn, as the gods of history had marked him as a key figure in their game of 4D chess.
I have been chosen.
But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, we must return to the British side of the story. After Harthacnut's death, the English crown returned to the House of Wessex, to Edward the Confessor, who had spent several years exiled in Normandy with his mother's family. He arrived in England and was crowned as king, but as fate would have it, he would be the last monarch of the Anglo-Saxon House of Wessex. At that time, the king had absolute power, although he was advised by the Witan. Edward abandoned the old system of counties, creating new ones, and it's worth noting the figure of Shire Reeve, a representative of the king in those counties, who was in charge of collecting taxes, imparting justice, maintaining public roads, protecting the peace, and calling the shire levies. This position of Shire Reeve later evolved into the modern term sheriff.
Legal.
Since we're talking about Edward the Confessor, we must mention his troubled relationship with Godwin, Earl of Wessex. The reason behind their bad blood was that Godwin, as we mentioned earlier, had been involved in the death of the king's brother Alfred. In spite of that, or perhaps because of it, who knows, King Edward married one of the Earl's daughters, Edith. Alas, the pair were childless, with some sources even suggesting that their marriage was chaste, which is not exactly an ideal situation for the leader of a hereditary monarchy. And to make things just a little bit messier, Godwin despised the Normans, while Edward was half Norman. Remember, his mother was Emma of Normandy. In any case, in 1051, King Edward ordered Godwin to go attack the troublesome town of Dover in Kent, but he refused, openly defying the king. Godwin lost the ensuing conflict and was exiled to Flanders, where he soon gathered new supporters and returned to England, so the king was forced to kiss and make up, probably not literally. Godwin was then reinstated as Earl, but died a couple of years later, leaving his children as important earls, with one of them being particularly relevant to our story, Harold Godwinson. Remember that name. Or don't, just wait till I tell you more about him. One thing that Edward the Confessor did was rebuild St. Peter's Abbey in Westminster, right next to London. This was the first English church to be built in the Romanesque style and was concluded in 1060, 6 years before the monarch's death. He was buried there himself and was joined 9 years later by his wife Edith. Returning to our story, Edward the Confessor was still childless and his health was becoming a matter of national concern, with various factions making moves in preparation for his passing. But suddenly a tiny glimmer of hope appeared out of nowhere in the person of Edward the Exile, son of Edmund Ironside, and thus first in line to the throne. He had been presumed dead after Canute the Great exiled him to Scandinavia upon conquering England, but in fact he had somehow managed to make his way to the court of Hungary of all places. In 1056, Edward the Confessor heard the news and recalled him with the intention of making him his heir, to continue the rule of the House of Wessex. Unfortunately, almost as soon as he arrived in England, he died under strange circumstances. That's strange in air quotes because, as we said earlier, there were several parties interested in taking the crown and therefore interested in getting rid of him. Then, in 1066, Edward the Confessor died, and that's when the terrible succession mess which had been brewing for a long time finally reached its boiling point. It's time to introduce the contenders of the upcoming Royal Rumble.
And here we go!
First, the Witan decided that Earl Harold Godwinson, brother-in-law to Edward, would be king, although this was by no means a unanimous decision. In fact, his very own brother Tostig went over to the Norwegian monarch Harald Hardrada, seeking an alliance to take the English throne by force. In addition, there was also William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, and a relative, albeit distant, of the king through Emma of Normandy. Moreover, William argued that a few years earlier, while at his court, Harold had sworn not to stand in his way if he was ever in line for the English throne.
He lied.
And that's how this three-way struggle for England began. The Viking king Harald Hardrada disembarked at Northumbria and started to make his way towards York. Several English earls tried to stop his advance, but Harold defeated them at the Battle of Fulford and occupied the Northumbrian capital. At this point, the official King of England, Harold Godwinson, had no choice but to travel north from London to repel the invaders. Harold's army made it there so fast that they managed to catch the enemy by surprise, falling on them at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. As its name indicates, a crucial part of this battle took place on a bridge, where a Viking hero held off the Anglo-Saxon troops single-handedly, giving the invaders time to regroup. But that wasn't quite enough to win the day. The Norwegians were defeated and both Tostig and Harald Hardrada were killed, the latter by an arrow in the throat. Ouch. This stopped the last Scandinavian invasion of England and is considered to mark the end of the Viking Age. Everyone take off their historically inaccurate horned helmets as a mark of respect. At this point, the English were pleased because they had resolved one of their battlefronts, but they didn't have time to celebrate or even to recover, as they still had to deal with William the Conqueror, who was preparing to attack from Normandy. The chronicles say that William felt entirely optimistic because, while he was waiting for the right time to cross the English Channel, he saw Halley's Comet and interpreted it as a good omen, which of course makes one wonder, did he think it was like a private comet showing just for him? Because if his opponents could also see the comet, who was it intended to be a good sign for?
I hadn't thought of it that way.
In any case, William and his knights disembarked in England and promptly began to take over everything they came across until Harold Godwinson arrived to stop them. That's when both sides faced off at the Battle of Hastings, considered to be one of, if not the most important battle in English history. The development of this battle is chronicled by several sources and, as you would expect in that situation, there are multiple contradictions. Nevertheless, most of them agree that the English formed a defensive shield wall at the top of a hill while William's forces attacked, trying to break their formation. However, the Normans were beaten back again and again, so instead they faked a retreat. Sneaky. The ruse worked and the English gave chase, seeking to finish off the invaders, but that was their undoing. The Norman cavalry appeared by surprise, surrounded them and began to mow down the English. Then came the crucial moment. As Harold's troops were starting to break up, William's archers arrived and peppered them with arrows. According to the story, although this is by no means certain, Harold Godwinson was killed when one of those arrows struck him in the eye. After the battle, William's Norman army made their way to London. The English clergy and nobility had elected as their king Edgar Ætheling, the son of Edward the Exile, but the poor lad had very little support, and when William arrived, he had no trouble taking over the city and being recognised as the new King of England on the 25th of December 1066. At Westminster Abbey. Thus, despite having just 10,000 soldiers against an entire country who viewed them as unwelcome invaders, William the Conqueror became the first English king of the Norman dynasty, whose history we will cover in the next video. The coronation of William the Conqueror as King of England in 1066 was the beginning of the Norman dynasty. However, Monsieur Will didn't have an easy time of it when it came to ruling England. Consider that there were about 20,000 Normans faced with a population of 2 million Englishmen who regarded them as upstart invaders.
Nobody wants you here!
Plus, the children of Harold Godwinson, whom William had defeated and killed at Hastings, fled to Ireland, and from there they worked to instigate rebellion against the new king. Therefore, William began by befriending several important English earls like Edwin of Mercia, Morcar of Northumbria, and Wulfheof of Northampton, allowing them to keep their lands and titles as long as they supported him. He even gave some land in the far north to Edgar Ætheling, the last rightful heir of the House of Wessex, so he could retire quietly and not cause any trouble. However, in 1068, Edwin and Morcar revolted against William, who didn't take it well and reacted swiftly by going after them and defeating both. So as to prevent any such uprisings in the future, the Normans ordered the construction of multiple fortresses all over England.
The great fortress of Rohan.
At first they were simple stockades, made out of wood and dirt, or motte and bailey castles, but these were gradually replaced by solid stone structures. One famous example is Warwick Castle, which was later followed by others in York, Nottingham, Lincoln, Huntingdon and Cambridge. However, the most famous of these fortresses was the White Tower, later renamed the Tower of London. Back then it looked nothing like it does nowadays, but it didn't take too long before they started using it to lock up people.
I can get you out of here. I helped build these cells.
William also created a ring of fortifications surrounding London, with Windsor Castle in Berkshire being one of the most important. It started out as a wooden motte and bailey fort, but like other similar locations, it was soon replaced by a proper castle. Another important one was Arundel Castle in Sussex, where we can easily see the mound atop which the fortress was constructed. In addition, Oxford Castle was erected on a small promontory, on which a stone tower called St George's Tower had been built. Other notable examples are the amazing Norwich Castle, you should go and see it if you can, Durham Castle and Newcastle Castle, created to protect England's northern border. In addition, the Normans slowly began to make headway into Wales, and there we can find Chepstow Castle and Pembroke Castle. In any case, Westminster Palace, built by Edward the Confessor as we saw in the previous episode, eventually became the habitual residence of the English monarchy during the Middle Ages. William expropriated a lot of land all over the country, and in one such plot in Hampshire, he created the New Forest as a preserve for his favourite pastime, killing small animals. Little could he imagine that the forest would later witness the death of his own son.
My son?
And since we're talking about how William managed the territory, we must mention that he established a feudal system throughout England. All the lands belonged to him personally, but he ceded their control to lords, who were subject to certain duties and obligations towards the crown. For example, if there was a war and any of these lords or their knights didn't come to support the king, he could freely take their land and give it to other, more loyal vassals. These kinds of political decisions were communicated by the king at the Curia Regis. Serfs such as peasants and artisans became bound to the lords ruling their region in exchange for protection, while tradesmen, and also Jews, remained under the king's direct jurisdiction. At the same time, Christians were prohibited from lending money for profit, whereas Jewish people weren't, so some of them took advantage of this legal loophole to become very rich through banking and similar businesses.
Hello, Jews!
In 1069, Edgar Ætheling rebelled. Of course, he wasn't alone. He had gained the support of Waltheof, Earl of Northampton, and also the Danish king Sweyn II, who had arrived in England with a powerful fleet. Together they managed to take York, and Edgar was proclaimed king by his followers. When William heard about this, he was furious and decided to make an example of the upstarts. First, he paid off the Danes so that they would go back the way they came, and once they'd left, he pursued Edgar all the way up to Scotland, where he took refuge with his brother-in-law, King Malcolm III. William then began a bloody campaign known as the Harrying of the North, which involved numerous executions, as well as the burning and razing of many villages and fields in the area. It was extremely violent, but it was also successful, and by 1070, William had done away with all opposition. Well, almost all. There remained a small focus of resistance led by Hereward the Outlaw, who operated from the Isle of Ely in the marshes of Cambridgeshire. Hereward, with the support of King Sweyn II of Denmark and Earl Morcar, conducted multiple raids and generally pestered William until he eventually got fed up and did away with him. Once he had ensured peace and stability throughout the kingdom, William placed a trusted friend, the priest Lanfranc, as Archbishop of Canterbury, the foremost religious figure in England. He also built various temples, including the Battle Abbey, a monastery constructed near the site of the Battle of Hastings, probably to commemorate his great victory. Talking about this battle, we must mention the Bayeux Tapestry, a 70-metre-long embroidered cloth depicting the entire history of the Norman conquest of England. You can still see it today in, of all places, Bayeux. As you can imagine, the Norman invasion also changed things in the cultural sphere. Since most of the Old English nobility and clergy were replaced by Normans, their particular dialect of ancient French became the language of power in this New England. Ancient English fused with ancient French and became consolidated as Medieval English, along with an admixture of Anglo-Saxon, Briton, Latin and Danish.
Speak English.
Around 1073, William considered that he had finally consolidated his hold over England and gradually turned his attention back to his homeland of Normandy, particularly the capital city of Rouen, where he spent most of the rest of his reign. So although he ruled both territories, in practice they operated as two completely different states. On that side of the English Channel, William had a few run-ins with Fulk IV, Count of Anjou, a member of the Angevin dynasty, which was a very important family in French nobility. Their main bone of contention was the rich county of Maine. With this we arrive at the year 1075, where the event known as the Revolt of the Earls took place. It happened while William was away from England, and various earls joined forces against him. The key conspirators were the Briton, Ralph de Gale, Earl of East Anglia, and the Norman, Roger de Breteuil, Earl of Hereford. The reason behind this uprising is not entirely clear, but everything seems to indicate that it was a classic case of powerful men being greedy and wanting even more power. The rebellion ended with William returning to England and smacking them around, just like you should smack the subscribe and like buttons. William probably had plenty of experience smacking about rebellious individuals since he had several children with his wife Matilde. The firstborn son was Robert Curthose, followed by Richard, who died young while out hunting, William Rufus, and lastly Henry. He also had 6 daughters, but unfortunately history has left us hardly any records about them. Big surprise. What the records do say is that the brothers didn't get on very well. As an example, in 1077, William Rufus and Henry emptied a urinal on their elder brother Robert, and this predictably ended in a big fight. Not long afterwards, Robert rebelled against his father. It's not entirely clear why, maybe something to do with his brother's toilet humour, or the inheritance, who knows. Regardless, the key point is that Robert was supported by various Norman nobles, and together they sieged the castle of Remillard in southern Normandy. William soon expelled them from his domains, but Philip I of France gave these rebels the fortress of Guelberoy to use them as a proxy force against William. The situation ended in a battle between father and son, in which William was defeated and peace finally returned when he promised Robert that he would inherit the Duchy of Normandy upon his death, and also probably that no one else would empty wee over his head. Thanks to this, the final decade of William's life was slightly more relaxed. The most notable aspect of this period is that in 1083 Robert rebelled once again, with the help of Philip I of France once again. What a pain in the arse. However, this made it clear to William that Normandy needed to find allies against the French monarchy, so he married his daughter Constance to Alan IV, Duke of Brittany. In 1085, William ordered the creation of the Domesday Book, an exhaustive survey of all his English domains. His envoys went around, county by county, recording every last bit of property of each landowner and thus calculating the taxes they should pay. A little bit later, in 1087, William travelled to the French region of Vexin, located between Rouen and Paris, to fight his son Robert once again.
Well, it's Groundhog Day.
Alas, William would never complete the journey. The actual events are not entirely clear. It appears that he either fell ill or fell from his horse, but either way, the result was that William the Conqueror died soon afterwards before he could complete the siege of Mantes. His corpse was moved to the Abbey of Saint Etienne, or Men's Abbey in Caen, which he himself had ordered to be built. The chronicles say that the funeral was spoiled by a peasant who'd managed to get in somehow and started to complain that they were all a bunch of bastards because they had expropriated the land illegally from his family in order to build the church. As it turns out, the guy was telling the truth, so they had to pay him off to keep him quiet. Some things never change.
Take your money and get out, because I'm tired of listening to your mouth.
Upon William's death, just as promised, Robert inherited the Duchy of Normandy. However, England was not included in the package, and instead was handed over to the third son, who became William II, although he was generally known as William Rufus, meaning William the Red. No, of course he wasn't a communist. The name came either because he was red-haired when he was a young boy, or because of his ruddy complexion, or perhaps because he had different coloured eyes. Nobody really knows. What we do know is that he was considered extravagant, which was code for gay, because he had no interest in marriage or fathering any children. If you've seen our previous episode, you'll recall another childless king of England, Edward the Confessor, and the amount of trouble that led to. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. When William the Conqueror died, his sons didn't manage to agree upon the inheritance, and so they began to fight amongst themselves in what is known as the Rebellion of 1088. Robert sought to unite England and Normandy under his rule, and for that he planned to invade England. However, he didn't quite have the means for it.
Wars are rather expensive.
And so he requested support, mainly in the form of money, from his brother Henry, who agreed to finance the invasion in exchange for the Norman county of Cotentin. But after having secured the means, Robert was unable to carry out his invasion, because William Rufus outsmarted him by getting a powerful nobleman from Rouen called Conan Pilatus to rebel against Robert and siege the Norman capital. Robert enlisted the help of his brother Henry, and together they managed to contain the fighting and eventually capture Conan, with Henry ending up so fed up with this Conan that he threw him off the top of a castle tower. By 1091, both King William Rufus and Duke Robert had exhausted their troops and treasure, so they decided to call it a draw and stop the fighting. This, however, did not work out well for Henry, as his brothers then took away his county of Cotentin and besieged him at Mont-Saint-Michel. He was forced to surrender and flee, and for a while ruled the town of Domfront from atop a little castle. Lovely. Then a new threat rose up in the north. No, not ice giants. It was Malcolm III of Scotland, who made an incursion into England. William Rufus stopped him and then, in order to prevent future trouble, built Carlisle Castle in Cumbria. But that wasn't very effective because Malcolm returned with an even greater force. The Norman noble Robert de Mowbray led the English troops at the Battle of Alnwick in 1093 and succeeded in killing both Malcolm and his son. It seems that this gave William confidence, so he decided to attack Wales and managed to conquer several territories in the south, including the great kingdom of Deheubarth. In 1093, he appointed a new archbishop, Anselm of Canterbury, widely considered the greatest theologian of his generation. But then Anselm revealed himself as a strong supporter of Gregorian reform, which advocated the Pope's spiritual superiority over all Christian kingdoms. William wasn't on board with this, and that caused a few disagreements between them, to the point that Anselm ended up exiled at the court of Pope Urban II. The Pope was a diplomatic guy and eventually reached a deal with William Rufus, agreeing to support the independence of Anglo-Norman clergy with all its particularities in exchange for William recognising him as Pope. This period left us several religious constructions such as the cathedrals of Durham, Winchester and the most beautiful of all, Norwich Cathedral. Also, 1096 saw the founding of Oxford University. Well, in all fairness, the exact date isn't really known, but what is sure is that classes had already started in that year. And of course, we couldn't mention Pope Urban II without talking about the First Crusade, especially because Robert Curthose, remember him, decided to join this fun summer camp and left none other than William Rufus as a regent of the Duchy of Normandy in his absence. For the next 4 years, while in control of Normandy, William tried to conquer both the county of Maine and the region of Vexin, but with no success.
He's a failure.
Then, in August of 1100, William Rufus went hunting in the New Forest and appeared dead with an arrow sticking out of his side. While no one really knows what happens, the chronicles say that one of the noblemen who accompanied him, Walter Tyrrell, shot him by mistake. However, some believe that it was no accident and instead had been orchestrated by his younger brother Henry in order to take the throne. Ooh, it's very Game of Thrones this, isn't it?
You murdered your own brother.
If there was indeed a plot, the truth is that it worked perfectly because Henry Beauclerk was then crowned as Henry I, new King of England and Duke of Normandy. But of course, nothing in this family ever went smoothly, so no sooner did Henry place his bum on the throne than his brother Robert returned from crusading in the Holy Lands and sought to reclaim his Duchy of Normandy. Henry had zero intention of letting it go, and a civil war ensued. Over the following 6 years, Henry and Robert fought non-stop until the Battle of Tinchebray in 1106, where Robert was ultimately defeated and then jailed, first in Wiltshire and then in Cardiff, where he remained until his death. With regard to his rule, Henry I gained the support of earls and lords with the Charter of Liberties, which shifted some of the king's power to these nobles. Not a lot, of course, being king was still a great gig, but this did set a precedent for the famous Magna Carta of 1215. In order to gain legitimacy, Henry I married Matilda of Scotland, also known as Good Queen Maud, daughter of King Malcolm III of Scotland and also niece of Edgar Etheling, and therefore great-granddaughter of the old King Edmund Ironside of the House of Wessex. This union produced 2 children, Matilda, who would later marry the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V and thus be known as Empress Matilda, and William Adelin. In addition, old Henry was a bit of a horny dog and had plenty of illegitimate children, or bastards as they were referred to in those times before political correctness, with a host of mistresses and sex workers.
I like a sex machine.
When he wasn't in the sack, the king met with his inner circle of nobles known as the Domus, which in turn was divided into 3 positions. The Chancellor managed royal documents, the Chamberlain was in charge of finance, and the Master Marshal organised travel, lodging and domestic service for His Majesty. The king also held regular formal audiences with the nobility at the Curia Regis. Since Henry I maintained an itinerant royal court, travelling from one place to another, he built multiple palaces and castles throughout the land. One such famous place was at Woodstock in Oxfordshire, where the king kept a menagerie of exotic animals, including lions, leopards, and even an Indominus Rex. Oh wait, that's a typo. And even a bear.
That's a good one.
Henry I ruled for 35 years and did it quite well. He skillfully manipulated multiple English and Norman nobles to achieve his political goals, established an effective network of spies who kept him informed about any conspiracies against him, and swiftly eliminated anyone who threatened his power. These measures allowed him to have a relatively smooth reign, and so he had time to build lots of stuff. Since he was a fanboy of the Cluniac order, he extended the Romanesque style throughout England. as in the case of Reading Abbey in Berkshire, completed in 1121, and also Exeter and Peterborough cathedrals. His biggest quarrel was with the King of France, Louis VI, and his allies Fulk V, Count of Anjou, and Baldwin VII, Count of Flanders. It all came about because Henry wanted his son, William Adelin, to be his heir in Normandy, but the French king refused to recognise him, preferring to see the crown on the head of William Clito, son of Robert Curthose, and so they had to settle it in the medieval way, with a good old war. This led to a low period for Henry. By 1116, French, Angevin and Flemish troops were raiding the Norman countryside. 2 years later, his wife Matilda died, and then, just to top things off, one of his own illegitimate daughters, Juliane de Fontevrault, tried to assassinate him with a crossbow. Well, to be fair, they had had a major fallout which involved Julian's daughters being blinded and disfigured, but we're not going down that particular horrible rabbit hole because the video would have to be 3 hours long.
Well, who's got time for that?
Henry's fortune gradually began to improve when Fulk V travelled to the Holy Land and left the county of Maine in his charge, in exchange for the betrothal of Henry's heir, William Adelin, to his daughter. In 1119, Henry tried to take the reign of Vexin, and there he had to fight the French King Louis at the Battle of Prémule. Henry was victorious, and so in 1120 the two kings signed a peace treaty and became besties. So things were going great, everything was resolved, and William Adelin was set to inherit Henry's crown. But then fate intervened. That same year, William travelled to England on a boat, but everyone on board, including the crew, got wasted and they ended up hitting a reef and sinking. William Adelin drowned, along with another 300 poor souls, in what has come to be known as the White Ship Disaster, which threw the succession into mayhem. Henry quickly married Adeliza of Louvain at Windsor Castle, hoping to conceive a male heir, but unfortunately it didn't happen. Moreover, William Adelin's death put an end to the deal with Fulk V, who then demanded the return of everything he had conceded, including the county of Maine, which Henry refused to do, and so they started fighting again.
Fight!
Regardless, that didn't solve the problem of who would become Henry's heir. In the event, the king chose his nephew, Stephen of Blois, which seemed to settle the matter. However, by now you're probably expecting a but, and you'd be right. In 1125, something unexpected happened. Holy Roman Emperor Henry V died, leaving Henry's daughter, Empress Matilda, a widow, and thus giving him an opportunity to appoint a direct descendant as heir. This may sound perfectly normal to us nowadays, but back then it was very unusual to choose a woman. Nevertheless, English nobility proved to be very open-minded about it, and Henry got most of them on board with the plan. Very woke, guys.
Thank you for being so cooperative.
In addition to keeping the crown in the family, Matilda also gave Henry a way of re-establishing his alliance with Fulk of Anjou. Recall that they had agreed to marry Henry's son to Fulk's daughter. In 1127, Matilda married Fulk's son, Geoffrey V, or Geoffrey the Fair, and the couple had a child, also called Henry, who would later become the first king of the Plantagenet dynasty, whose name is derived from the broom blossom or Plantagenet, which Geoffrey usually wore in his hat. Stylish. The Plantagenets would rule England for more than 3 centuries, as we will see in future videos, but before we get to that, we have to deal with a very dark and chaotic period. It all began in 1135 with Henry's death, reportedly from eating too many lampreys, which is a sort of weird river eel. And while Matilda and Geoffrey were at Anjou organising the funeral, Henry's initial heir, his nephew, Stephen of Blois, rushed over to England from Bologna and got himself crowned as king. Upon hearing the news, Matilda hit the roof and swore to take the throne, kicking off a 20-year-long period of civil war known as the English Anarchy.
Anarchy in the UK!
Hark ye all, and bid farewell to the law and order in the lands of England and Normandy. It was good while it lasted. Stephen of Blois was the new king of England, but it came at a high cost. Not only did he have to fight his cousin, Empress Matilda, over the crown, but he also faced rebellions all over the country, headed by English earls, Welsh leaders and Scottish invaders. Since this was a very chaotic and confusing period, sort of like a crossover between The Last Duel and Fight Club, remixed with Battle Royale and directed by Tarantino, we are only going to cover the main points.
Yeah, well, now, keep it short.
To begin with, we have to mention an important figure, Robert of Gloucester, a bastard son of Henry I who controlled that county, as well as some lands in Normandy, and who sided with his half-sister Matilda against their cousin Stephen. Matilda and Geoffrey V had taken over Normandy, which had initially supported Stephen, and then in 1139 got themselves a fleet with which to invade England. This was the beginning of the Anglo-Norman Civil War, which quickly became a war of attrition, since the main tactic was to siege castles that were pretty well defended, and therefore conquering each one of them could take several months. At that time, siege engines were scarce and still rather rudimentary, while open field battles were too risky. A quick note on architecture before we get into the thick of the fighting. The book in the series, The Pillars of the Earth, set during this conflict, depict the construction of a cathedral representing the transition between the Romanesque and Gothic styles. Aren't we good to you? We give you a whole rounded picture of things.
Anything more we can do for you?
In 1141, after countless skirmishes all over England, King Stephen was captured by Robert of Gloucester at the Battle of Lincoln. Matilda was overjoyed, as she expected this would be checkmate, and went over to London with the intention of being crowned once and for all. But after getting there, things turned sour, supposedly because she imposed new taxes, and also because of her haughty attitude towards the nobility. And this ended with the city rioting in favour of Stephen, so Matilda had to flee out the back door. Embarrassing. Then, in another conflict which took place in Winchester, Robert of Gloucester was captured by Stephen's supporters, who then proceeded to exchange him for the English king. The following year, the king managed to trap Matilda at the siege of Oxford Castle, but she was able to escape during the night with an N, aided by her knights with a K.
I saw what you did there.
So, after lots and lots of fighting, the war was back to square one, and the situation entered a stalemate. As the former chaos devolved into outright devastation, the population started to get completely fed up with all this pointless squabbling. And to make things just a little bit messier, on one side, several English earls rose up in arms against King Stephen, while on the other, many Angevin nobles joined the Second Crusade and left for Jerusalem, weakening Matilda. In addition, her half-brother and main ally, Robert of Gloucester, died from a fever in 1147. Now, as we delve into the final stages, we have another key figure, Matilda's son, Henry Fitz-Empress, or Henry Kirkmantle. This lad became very important, particularly after 1151, when his father Geoffrey died and he became Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou. The following year, he married a great woman named Eleanor. No, sadly, not Eleanor Morton. She hadn't been born yet. This was Eleanor of Aquitaine. Thanks to this union, Henry added the Duchy of Aquitaine to his already substantial lands in northern France and gained control over a huge territory. Perhaps too huge to rule feasibly in the times before WhatsApp groups, as we will see later.
It's a little too much to handle.
And now let's try to wrap up this war. In 1153, Henry travelled to England to keep alive the claim for the throne that his parents had started. But after several more sieges, both sides decided they didn't really have the resources to continue fighting, and so they signed the Treaty of Wallingford, which established that Henry would inherit the crown when Stephen passed. Not that there were many other options, because the king's son Eustace had just died. This treaty finally put an end to the disastrous period of anarchy.
And it's about damn time, if you ask me.
The following year, in 1154, King Stephen died, and Henry succeeded him to the English throne as Henry II. He would go down in history as the first Angevin king of England, since his father belonged to the House of Anjou, but this newly formed dynasty, which controlled a vast territory comprising most of England and France, is better known as the Plantagenet dynasty. Among its members are some very famous names in English history, like Richard the Lionheart and Edward Longshanks, whom we will meet in the next video. At the end of the previous episode, we saw how the son of Geoffrey of Anjou and Empress Matilda, Henry II, gained the English throne and founded the Plantagenet dynasty, which would guide England's destiny for the following 330 years.
For far too long.
During the English Anarchy, many earls had become strong in their castles and were no longer really subject to the king, while Scotland and Wales had conquered some English territories. Therefore, Henry's top priority was to fight pretty much everyone and re-establish his authority. It is often said of King Henry II that he was merciless because he expelled several earls from their feuds to replace them with his loyal buddies.
You're fired.
Thanks to his double inheritance, combined with his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, heir to the huge Duchy of Aquitaine in France, Henry II gained control over the Angevin Empire, which comprised all the territory you can see on this map. His domain spanned from Scotland to the Pyrenees, making him one of Europe's most powerful rulers of the age. The problem was that this was not a unified kingdom in any way, shape or form, as each territory had its own language, laws, institutions and currency. To make matters worse, Henry only spoke French and needed an interpreter to understand and communicate in English. That's probably why he spent most of his reign at Rouen in Normandy and Angers in Anjou. In this, he was similar to most of his Norman predecessors and also several successors. They didn't like spending too much time in England because they said it was too cold, and also they probably wanted to stay as far away as possible from Manchester. As we said, Henry's wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was an extremely important and interesting figure, but then again, Eleanors are usually pretty great people. By the time she married Henry, she was already an experienced political beast, having been the former Queen of France, as well as a patron of culture and lover of poetry, as Eleanors are also pretty classy. Now she also became a mother, giving birth to 4 children. The eldest was Henry the Young King, who married Princess Margaret, daughter of King Louis VII of France. Thanks to this, the English king gained access to the territory of Vexin. After him came Richard, Geoffrey and John. Apart from the boys, they also had several daughters who married powerful men. In addition, Henry also had several bastard children, most notably, albeit not entirely confirmed, with Alice, Countess of Vexin and daughter of the King of France. This was quite the scandal at the time, because she was barely a child and engaged to his own son Richard. But apart from Alice, Henry had several mistresses, including Rosamund Clifford, a beautiful noblewoman about whom there are plenty of colourful legends that we unfortunately don't have time to get into.
A sex scandal has brought in reporters from around the world.
Henry also concerned himself with law and order. Until that time, the prevailing feudal law dictated that the lord of each estate resolved any cases affecting his vassals, but Henry sought more power to decide over certain matters, and to this effect, he established royal courts in each county, with sheriffs being in charge of bringing the convicts to justice. Years later, in 1188, Ranulph de Glanville drafted the Treatise of Glanville, which codified English law.
So boring.
And now we must talk about the problems that Henry II had with a key figure, Thomas Becket. It all began in 1162 with the death of Theobald of Bec, Archbishop of Canterbury, whereupon Henry decided to appoint his Chancellor, Thomas Becket, who had been Theobald's protégé, as new Archbishop. They had always been very close friends, but as soon as Becket put on the mitre, something inside him changed radically. Nobody really knows why. He left behind the ostentatious lifestyle he had led until then and became very austere. Next, he began challenging the king on certain important issues. For starters, Henry wanted the Church of England to be subject to him, so he could decide on ecclesiastical appointments and that kind of thing, but Becket told him to go fly a kite. The reason why this was important is because back then, any crime committed by a member of the clergy was judged by an ecclesiastical court instead of a civil one, and they were far more lenient and also didn't dole out physical punishments, let alone executions. But the problem was that nearly 1/6 of the population belonged to some sort of religious order, and therefore the king didn't have much power over a large number of people. So the first dispute between Henry and Becket was for this reason. To make matters worse, Becket then refused to give the king a share of the church's revenues, and things turned pretty sour between them. With this, we reach the year 1164, when Henry II passed the Constitutions of Clarendon, which formalised the king's supremacy and authority over the church. Many members of the clergy saw the writing on the wall and submitted to the king, but Becket continued to oppose him, so Henry had him arrested. Thomas Becket was then imprisoned and accused of several crimes, including misappropriation of funds and trying to appeal to the Pope without the king's consent. However, the Archbishop managed to escape and flee to France, gaining the protection of King Louis VII. From this new base, he contacted Pope Alexander III, but he wasn't able to provide much aid to Becket, as Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa had expelled him from Rome. With Becket out of his hair, at least for now, Henry went on a military spree. In 1166, he gained control over Brittany, and in 1169, he began the conquest of Ireland, an enterprise that would be prolonged over many centuries. It began with a man who is considered as the greatest traitor in the history of Ireland, the exiled King of Leinster, Dermot MacMurrough, who reached a deal with the Earl of Pembroke, Richard de Clare, commonly known as Strongbow, like the cider. In exchange for Richard's help in reclaiming the Irish throne, Dermot would give him the hand of his daughter Aoife and make him his heir. The pair managed to take Dublin, but the following year Dermot died and Richard was crowned King of Leinster. It was at this point that Henry II decided to intervene, and they quickly came to a friendly agreement. Richard would maintain control over Leinster, but as a fief, and thus began the conquest of Ireland, which would last until 1600.
Your island? You mean Ireland? Yeah, it's mine.
In 1170, Henry's son, Henry the Young King, was crowned as co-ruler. In theory, this should have been done by the Archbishop of Canterbury, but that was Henry's old rival Becket, and so instead, they had the Archbishop of York do it. As you can imagine, this just added more fuel to the fire of the ongoing conflict. After constant protesting by Becket, Pope Alexander III finally intervened and threatened with an interdict of all England as punishment. What the hell is an interdict, you ask? Well, simply put, it's a prohibition to conduct any of the church's rites and services. No mass, no weddings, communions or funerals. Faced with this situation, Henry II said to Becket,
"Tommy, old boy, why don't you come back to England so we can have a friendly chat?"
And so Becket did return, but not in the spirit that Henry was hoping, because he swiftly excommunicated several bishops who had sided with the king against him. By this point, Henry was well and truly fed up, so he cried out something along the lines of,
"Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?"
And this comment was immediately acted upon by 4 knights who sought to curry royal favour. They took it literally and went over to Canterbury, where they ended up killing Thomas Becket, hacking him to pieces right in the middle of Canterbury Cathedral, no less. Lovely.
Are you insane?
Unsurprisingly, the Archbishop's murder shocked all of Christendom. Becket was canonised and became a symbol of the Church's independence against states, while the king had to give up on his aspirations of controlling the Church of England and subject to a public penance. Remember how we said that the ecclesiastical courts seldom resorted to physical punishment? Well, in this case they made a big exception, because the king was whipped with a rod 5 times by each Bishop of Canterbury and 3 times by each monk. It is thought that there were about 80 monks in total, so the king probably didn't sit comfortably on his throne, or anywhere else, for quite a while. In addition, in 1172, Henry had to sign the Compromise of Avranches, which diluted the constitutions of Clarendon and allowed the church to maintain its own courts. One of the most famous prelates at this time was Hubert Walter, the papal legate in England, who would later become archbishop and play a role in foreign policy, but we'll come to that later. After all this excitement, one would assume that Henry's life would be more peaceful, but nothing could be further from the truth, as his biggest challenge still lay ahead. It began in 1173 and is known as the Great Revolt, when his wife and children all turned against him. The main reason behind this was greed. What a surprise. You see, the way the succession was set up was that the firstborn son, Henry the Young King, would inherit England, Normandy and Anjou. Geoffrey would have Brittany, Richard, who was Eleanor's favourite son, would keep Aquitaine, and finally John would have no territories, hence his nickname John Lackland, or Johnny No Lands. However, because Henry the Young King couldn't wait to start enjoying all the power and riches, he began to resent his dad, who at the same time favoured his favourite son John by giving him the castles of Chinon, Loudun and Mirbeau in France. That made Henry Jr. so jealous that he sought the aid of the French King Louis VII and began the Great Revolt, after ensuring the support of his mother and his brothers Richard and Geoffrey. When the situation began to heat up, Eleanor tried to run away dressed up as a man in an attempt to join her children in Paris, but she was caught and King Henry had her imprisoned at different castles for the following 16 years. Another king who tried to join this party was William I of Scotland, but he was quickly defeated and captured at the Battle of Alnwick in 1174. If you watched our previous episode on the Norman Dynasty, you may recall that there had already been a Battle of Alnwick, where another Scottish king, Malcolm III, had also been defeated. In order to be freed, William of Scotland had to sign the Treaty of Falaise, which officially made Scotland an English vassal state. This lasted for 15 years, until Richard I had to sell it back in order to finance his participation in the Third Crusade. After 18 months of intense fighting, Henry II was able to defeat the rebels, helping his children, and the conflict ended with the Peace of Montlouis, signed in 1174. This made it perfectly clear that Henry II was a strong and decisive king, but in a magnanimous gesture, he forgave his rebellious sons. Mind you, he still had all the barons who had plotted against him publicly executed, and that's the upside of being a Nepo baby. Later, Richard was made Duke of Aquitaine and gradually acquired a reputation as a fearless warrior, particularly during the siege of Taillebourg Castle in 1178. Moreover, Geoffrey became Duke of Brittany and John was appointed Lord of Ireland, while young Henry, who was still the king's heir, cooled down by travelling throughout Europe and spending his time at tournaments, which were kind of like the music festivals of the Middle Ages. This lasted until 1182, when young Henry's ambition flared up once again and he demanded more power from his father. The king refused to give him new territory and instead conceded that Richard and Geoffrey would give homage to young Henry for their lands. But Richard didn't like this new arrangement, and this set off a feud between the siblings. However, this conflict didn't last very long, as young Henry fell sick and died soon after. Now, Richard became the heir to the English throne, while John would be Duke of Aquitaine. Geoffrey continued to hold Brittany, but he wouldn't enjoy it for very long, as he was trampled to death during a tournament a few years later, and was then replaced by his son Arthur. Remember him, because he will play a role in later events. Richard and his father had a terrible relationship, and it seemed that Richard, instigated by his mother, had even made plans to dethrone Henry with the help of the new French king, Philip II Augustus. But in the end, it wasn't necessary. As in the previous family conflict, disease resolved the situation and Henry II died in 1189. It is said that, while convalescent, his heart finally gave out when he discovered that his favourite son John had sided with Richard against him.
You can't handle the truth!
Just like our hearts will give out if you don't subscribe and like and comment and share. After Henry's death, Richard I, also known as Richard the Lionheart, inherited his father's extensive kingdom. The story says that, on the day of his coronation at Westminster Abbey, some groups of Jewish people who had brought gifts for the new king, despite being banned from attending the ceremony, were assaulted and beaten. This is quite likely because they were widely discriminated against, allegedly because of the high interest they charged when lending money, a trade that Jewish people specialised in since Christian religion forbade it. Sadly, these attacks began to spread throughout the country, with one particularly terrible case taking place in York, where a large group of them who were being attacked by a mob of bullies and bigots sought refuge in the wooden tower of a fortification. The assailants then set fire to the tower, and all the Jews burned to death or died trying to escape. It seemed that Richard tried to keep the peace, but there certainly weren't many punishments dealt out. Part of the reason why Richard I wanted peace in England was because he was about to leave the country for a long time. It was the year 1190, and every European noble worth his salt was set to travel to the Holy Land in order to fight Saladin, who had conquered Jerusalem some time earlier. In retaliation, Christendom organised the Third Crusade, also known as the King's Crusade because, in addition to Richard, several other monarchs also took part, including the King of France, Philip Augustus. Unfortunately for English commoners, in order to finance the expedition, Richard raised taxes considerably, which never makes for a very popular ruler.
No new taxes!
King Richard appointed two regents during his absence, Hugh de Pucet, Bishop of Durham, and William de Mandeville, Earl of Essex, although the latter died soon afterwards and was replaced by William Longchamp. He also had this setup supervised by his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. However, Richard's brother, John Lackland, did not appreciate being overlooked, and so he began to conspire with the King of France, seeking to gain the throne. This led to some minor skirmishes, but nothing that changed the status quo. On his way to the crusade, specifically in Sicily, Richard's mother introduced him to the Princess Berengaria of Navarre, daughter of King Sancho VI. and he decided to take her along with him on the crusade. Not my first choice for a date, to be honest, but it worked out for him. Richard then conquered Cyprus from the Byzantines, and it seems that this conquest also conquered the heart of Berengaria, and they were married right there and then. It may sound very passionate and romantic, but Richard was still a pragmatic guy and money was tight, so he later sold the island to the Knights Templar. Eventually, Richard arrived at the Holy Land, started fighting against Saladin, and in a very short time he had managed to reclaim the city of Acre. The story goes that, despite being feverish and unwell at the time of the siege, Richard still managed to participate by shooting arrows from his stretcher. Once in control of Acre, he occupied the royal palace and removed the banner of Duke Leopold of Austria, who had also taken part in the conquest, arguing that a duke could not be of equal standing to a king. However, as we will see, he would later come to regret this.
And he could be trouble down the line.
As the crusade dragged on, the French king decided to return home, but Richard was enjoying himself, and so he stayed for a while. He sieged the city of Jaffa and managed to conquer that as well. It is told that, on one occasion, he had nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners executed because Saladin was late in paying their ransom. It's a bit harsh if you ask me. Richard won several battles against the Ayyubids, but he was never able to retake Jerusalem. Nevertheless, the courage he displayed during these encounters earned him the name Lionheart, which, to be fair, is pretty damn cool.
That is the best porn name I've ever heard, man.
In 1192, Richard and Saladin agreed a truce. This was partly because the king wanted to return to England in order to stop the machinations of his brother John, who had gained London's support and managed to become regent. However, Richard faced quite an odyssey in returning home. First, his ship ran aground near Aquileia in Italy, and so he had to continue the journey overland through the Holy Roman Empire. In order to avoid trouble, the company pretended to be pilgrims, but they were eventually recognised at an inn near Vienna, and Richard was captured and brought in front of his old friend Duke Leopold of Austria. The Duke then accused Richard of being involved in the death of his cousin, Conrad of Montferrat, during the Crusade in order to prevent him from becoming King of Jerusalem. And yeah, he was still bitter from having had his banner removed in Acre.
You people are so petty.
As it was, Richard spent several months imprisoned at Dürnstein Castle until the situation reached the ears of Pope Celestine III, who then excommunicated Leopold because, imprisoning epic crusaders was kind of frowned upon. That forced Leopold to let go of Richard, but he wasn't about to give up on his revenge. Instead of setting the Lionheart free, he handed him over to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, who proceeded to imprison him at Trifels Castle for 2 years. And why did he do this? Well, because the king had previously supported his political rival, Duke Henry the Lion, who was married to Richard's sister Matilda. The emperor was also excommunicated, but he didn't give a sheep's hoof about that, and instead demanded a ransom of £100,000 of silver from Richard's mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. In case you're wondering, that's a lot of silver, about 35 tons. Anyway, after all these mishaps, Richard finally made it back to England in 1194. He was received as a hero, and that made him feel magnanimous, so he forgave his brother John and appointed him his heir. However, his magnanimity didn't extend to the French king Philip Augustus, who had conquered parts of Normandy in the king's absence. Richard requested support from his father-in-law, Sancho VI, and after several encounters, like the Battle of Fréteval in 1194, he reclaimed most of the territories and pushed back the French king. But unfortunately for Richard, this campaign would be his last. In 1199, during the siege of the castle of Chalus-Chabrol, while he was taking a defiant walk in front of the walls, a boy sought to take revenge for the death of his family and shot him with a crossbow. He hit Richard in the shoulder, the wound turned gangrenous and eventually caused the king's death. Some stories say that Richard's last act before dying was to forgive the child and even give him some money. But to be fair, other sources say that the boy was flayed alive, so take your pick. England had a new king, John I, also known as John Lackland, who has gone down in history as the worst Plantagenet monarch because he made several poor decisions. Mind you, the country was always going through a fair bit of trouble. The first problem came from Arthur of Brittany, son of John's brother Geoffrey, who thought the crown would look far better on his head, and so a battle for power broke out between them. The English supported John, while the French sided with Arthur. Then, in 1202, John conducted a surprise attack on Mirabeau Castle, where the French king, Philip Augustus, held his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, as a hostage. He captured 200 enemy knights, and also his nephew Arthur, whom he held captive for a while until one day, while drunk, he executed him personally, then tied a rock to the corpse and threw it in a river. This led several nobles to remove their support and allow Philip Augustus to conquer Normandy, Anjou and Maine. Faced with this setback, in 1203 John fled Rouen for England, the only territory he managed to retain, along with a small part of Aquitaine that came to be known as Gascony, although later, upon the death of his mother Eleanor, the rest was all conquered away from him. This defeat led many to view John as a weak king, and so he spent the rest of his reign attempting to reclaim the duchy, albeit with no success. Instead, John ruled from England, but since he was deprived of his considerable Norman income, he had to raise taxes to finance his military campaigns.
Double the taxes, triple the taxes, squeeze every last drop.
Even reaching the point of inventing new taxes, which predictably didn't go down well with the population. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Hubert Walter, and one of the most influential noblemen in the kingdom, William Marshal, advised him to forget about the invasion because it was a hopeless cause. It took a while, but they eventually managed to persuade him to focus on England, and then he began to travel throughout the land, accompanied by his entourage of course, solving litigations and that kind of thing. In 1205, he wanted to appoint his ally, John de Grey, as Archbishop of Canterbury, but the clerical council selected a guy named Reginald instead, who quickly travelled to Rome in order to be confirmed by Pope Innocent III. But then the Pope said that he didn't like either candidate, and instead chose Cardinal Stephen Langton. John threw a tantrum and refused him entry into England, and so the Pope placed an interdict on England in 1208. King John told him where he could stick his interdict, and was then excommunicated, to which he responded by confiscating a lot of the church's property and income. Eventually, after 5 years, they made up. John subjected to Rome and accepted Langton as Archbishop. He would later play an important role during the most significant political reform in many centuries, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Right around that time, a certain bandit named Robert Hodd took refuge in the woods surrounding the city of York. It is thought that he gave rise to the myth of Robin Hood, the outlaw who lived in Sherwood Forest and stole from the rich to give to the poor. But then we have another fugitive from almost a century later who may also have inspired the various tales about this famous character. Regardless of his true origin, Robin Hood's rise in popularity came with Sir Walter Scott's 1819 novel Ivanhoe.
To Ivanhoe!
While all this was going on, the small kingdoms of Wales were being threatened by English expansion. That is, until the arrival of Llewellyn the Great, King of Gwynedd, who, through a combination of war and diplomacy, secured the loyalty of several Welsh lords and proclaimed himself as the first Prince of Wales at the Council of Aberdyfi in 1216. For his part, John Lackland still sought to reclaim his Angevin territories, and so he allied with several powerful rulers, Otto IV of the Holy Roman Empire, Count Ferdinand of Flanders, and a few others. The coalition fought Philip Augustus at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214, where the French prevailed. And this was quite a catastrophe for John, to the point that it is considered as the end of the Angevin Empire, since the subsequent Treaty of Chinon meant that he lost most of his French territories forever.
I've lost everything I loved.
With his popularity at an all-time low, several barons of the English north, headed by Robert Fitzwalter, rebelled against the king, calling themselves the Army of God. They marched on London and took the city, whereupon King John caved in and accepted to hold peace talks at Windsor Castle. On the 15th of June 1215, and with the mediation of Archbishop Langton, the king and barons drafted the super-famous Magna Carta, a political reform that removed some of the king's powers and gave more rights to freemen, especially the nobles and clergy. In addition, the document also included a limitation of taxes, more agile justice, ecclesiastical rights, and protection against illegal imprisonment and expropriation of land. Moreover, it established a council of 25 barons who would supervise its enforcement. Now, all of this sounded great in theory, but John didn't have any real intention of actually complying with Magna Carta, and instead petitioned Pope Innocent III to annul it. The Pope agreed to John's request, and that led to the First Barons' War, where the rebels began by taking Rochester Castle, while others rose in arms in the north, supported by the King of Scotland, Alexander II. Throughout the years, John had managed to save a considerable fortune, and so he could afford a decent army, which he now used to reconquer Rochester, as we can see in the film Ironclad. After that, John sieged Dover Castle and reclaimed the city, and later attacked the Northern Territories, kicking out Alexander II. It appeared as if things were finally going well for John, but alas, this was just a short reprieve before the final act. The end began in 1216, as the son of the French king Philip Augustus, Prince Louis, disembarked at Kent and, with the support of the rebels, claimed the English throne by virtue of being married to a granddaughter of Henry II. John set out to fight Prince Louis and his faction, but then a violent storm destroyed most of the English fleet, weakening his position. Finally, King John contracted dysentery and began to waste away until he ended up dying at Newark Castle in Nottinghamshire in 1216. Unfortunately for England, that didn't put an end to the Civil War. After John's death, the royal army supported his son, Henry, even though he was just 9 years old, fighting in his name at the battles of Lincoln and Sandwich, both of which they won in 1217. This gave victory to the Royalists, who kicked Prince Louis back to France and crowned Henry as the new King of England. Henry III, also known as Henry of Winchester, ruled England for the next 56 years, the longest reign in its history so far, and not surpassed until the 19th century.
Very impressive.
The first item on the new king's agenda was to put an end to the Barons' War, so in 1217 he signed the Magna Carta, and that made everyone happy. Well, he didn't actually sign it himself because he was still a child. Instead, it was his regent, the elderly William Marshal, Earl of Pembroke. With that, many of the rebel barons agreed to return the lands and castles they had taken during the Civil War, and so by 1227, Henry was able to formally assume his position as King of England.
Long live the king.
The king's most famous advisor was Hubert de Burgh, and Henry III placed so much trust in him that he appointed him Earl of Kent. However, in 1232, Hubert lost the royal favour when his rival, Peter de Roches, accused him of poisoning people and embezzling public money. The king imprisoned Hubert at the Tower of London, and Peter was rewarded with a good position in government. But all of this went to Peter's head, and he soon started taking over other nobles' lands. Those nobles protested, and in 1233 rose up against him, led by Richard, the son of William Marshal. After things got too heated and Richard died in a battle, the Archbishop of Canterbury had to intervene to put peace between both sides.
Things got heated, words were exchanged.
A few years later, in 1236, Henry III married Eleanor of Provence, who would later give him a son and heir, Edward Longshanks, as well as another boy, Edmund Crouchback, and 3 girls. Around this time, they began to build massive cathedrals in the Gothic style, such as Salisbury Cathedral, Exeter Cathedral, Wells Cathedral, and Lincoln Cathedral. And then there was Canterbury Cathedral, which had burned down, so they took the opportunity to rebuild it in the Gothic style. And we should also mention the new Westminster Abbey, where English monarchs are crowned and buried. It was located next to Westminster Palace, and nowadays that's where we can find the British Parliament, or what passes for it.
Behave yourself! Be a good boy, young man! Be a good boy!
In 1254, Pope Innocent IV offered Henry III the throne of the Kingdom of Sicily, and he decided to turn it over to his son Edmund. There was just one small detail left to sort out, and that was the fact that the Pope didn't actually hold the throne, so Sicily had to be conquered first, but doing so required a load of money, almost to the point of bankrupting England. And just like on previous occasions when the king demanded too much cash from them, the barons began to grumble. That led the king to assemble the nobles in Westminster in 1258 in order to discuss the collection of taxes to finance his Sicilian campaign. Unsurprisingly, the nobles totally opposed this idea and accused Henry of not respecting the Magna Carta. For this reason, 7 of the most influential barons forced the king to accept the provisions of Oxford. This was significant because it meant that the king ceded part of his power to a council of nobles and clergymen who would have the last word in terms of taxes and appointments. The council would meet at what became known as a parliament, initially at Oxford, but they later moved to Westminster. The most relevant figure in this council was Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester and also brother-in-law to the king. De Montfort brought about the lowest point for Henry in 1259 with the Treaty of Paris. Through it, the barons forced Henry III to renounce his rights over most of his grandfather's inheritance, that is, the Angevin Empire. But as a small compensation, the French King Louis IX, or Louis the Saint, recognised him as ruler of Gascony. Thanks, Louis. Naturally, Henry didn't like this at all, so in 1262 he persuaded the Pope to declare null and void the provisions of Oxford. This in turn caused Simon de Montfort to rebel, and he managed to take the city of London, kicking off the Second Barons' War. Simon began his campaign with several victories, which gave him control over most of the southeast of England. At one of those encounters, the Battle of Lewes, the king and his son Edward were captured by the rebels, along with Henry's brother, Richard of Cornwall, King of the Romans, which was the title used by the King of Germany back then. When he saw their side being crushed, Richard had tried to hide in a windmill, but the barons found him and forced him out among taunts and mockery. With Henry in his power, Simon de Montfort placed himself at the head of the government, under the title of Seneschal, even though he was de facto King of England. He convened Parliament without royal authorisation, and included in it several rich and influential citizens, as well as 2 knights from each county. However, many nobles were not convinced by this new arrangement, since they viewed Simon as a fanatic and arrogant reformer. On the other hand, many historians consider his role essential in the creation of the future House of Commons. But England's monarchic rule was not quite over yet, as Prince Edward managed to escape from his imprisonment at Hereford Castle and put together a large army. He then fought de Montfort at the Battle of Evesham in 1265, where the rebels were completely massacred. Simon de Montfort was killed, and Edward made an example of him, medieval style, by having his head, hands and feet cut off, and then his testicles hung around his nose.
His what?
Despite now being leaderless, the rebellion continued for a couple more years, until the rebels were definitively defeated at Kenilworth Castle, which was followed by the destruction of the last rebel holdout at the Isle of Ely in 1267. Afterwards, the Statute of Marlborough was proclaimed, re-establishing much, although not all, of the king's authority. It seems that all this action gave Prince Edward a taste for battle, and so he decided to join the Ninth Crusade in 1270. He nearly lost his life at the hands of a member of the Syrian Order of Assassins, but he survived, and, on his way back home in 1272, he found out about his father's death. Thus, as soon as he returned to England, he was crowned king, the first fully English monarch in over 200 years, since he had been born and raised entirely in the country, had a proper English name, and spoke the language fluently. It had certainly taken a while.
I know, it's hard to believe.
Now that the Plantagenet dynasty had lost most of their continental possessions, they focused their ambition on the British Isles. Things were about to turn rough, with plenty of violence, destruction and suffering, as we will see in the next episode. First things first, astute observers who watched our last episode will have noticed that it ended in 1272 with the coronation of Edward I, and so they'll be asking,
hey, how come he's Edward I if there's already been other kings named Edward,
Well, that's because back then, people were more into sobriquets, that's a fancy word for nickname, so historians didn't really start numbering kings until some centuries later, and in many cases those historians had their own reasons for when to start counting. Maybe because they sought to indicate a clear rupture point, in this particular case perhaps the Norman rule, or perhaps because they simply didn't know how many previous kings had shared a name. Some history be like that.
That's disappointing.
Now, one more quick note before we start our story. Edward I had a brother, Edmund Crouchback, who gave rise to the House of Lancaster, while Edward himself would later originate the House of York. You don't need to remember this right now, but it will be important for our next video, in which we cover Game of Thrones, the War of the Roses. Okay, with all that out the way, we can finally get down to business. From the very beginning of his rule, Edward I, better known as Edward Longshanks because apparently he was quite tall, wanted to expand his domains. In fact, immediately after being anointed by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Edward removed his crown, promising not to wear it again until he had recovered all the lands that his father, Henry III, had lost. The problem was that France was very powerful at that moment, so Edward began by turning his attention to the neighbouring land of Wales, which he started invading in 1276. The official excuse for this was that the Prince of Wales, Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, had stopped paying homage and, to add insult to injury, intended to marry Eleanor de Montfort, daughter of the man who years ago had rebelled against his father, imprisoned Edward, and almost overthrown the Plantagenet dynasty. Edward I sent a massive army on this campaign, and they proceeded directly to take the island of Anglesey, known as the breadbasket of Wales. After witnessing their success, Llywelyn had to surrender almost all of Wales to the English, save for the kingdom of Gwynedd. Edward then sent hundreds of English colonists to settle down in Wales, and that caused considerable disputes amongst the population. This eventually led Llywelyn's brother Dafydd, who had previously supported Edward, to rise up against him in 1282. Llywelyn joined him but was killed in battle, while Dafydd was captured and executed. Then, with the Statute of Rhuddlan, or Statute of Wales, signed in 1284, all of Wales came under English control. In order to keep the Welsh in check, Edward built several fortresses and castles, like the ones at Harlech and Conwy. And then there was Carnarvon Castle, where Edward's wife, Eleanor of Castile, gave birth to the future king, Edward II, who was thus named Prince of Wales, and since then, this is a title given to the heirs of the British throne, and the Welsh just love it.
I'm warning you, being this sarcastic is dangerous!
Another conflict that arose during Edward's reign was with the Jewish community. Back then, these poor people lived in ghettos and were forced to wear distinctive markings. In 1275, Edward issued the Statute of the Jewry, forbidding the lending of money, which was their most common profession, and thus forcing them to find other ways to make a living. But the problem was, nobody wanted to sell them any land or accept them as apprentices. Later, in 1290, Parliament said to the king,
"Hey Eddie, if you got rid of the Jews, you could grab all their property."
And so it took him about one heartbeat to make the decision to expel them all from England. Thus, these poor lot were left with no other option but to relocate, mostly to France, Scotland, the Netherlands and Poland. On a positive note, Edward issued other statutes which were far more progressive. He reformed politics to provide free men with more representation in Parliament, affording them more rights regardless of their birth and wealth, as well as punishing bribery, investing in road maintenance, peacekeeping and several things of this nature.
Going to make this country a better place.
And now we have to look at the tricky issue of Scotland, which is very messy but also very interesting. It all began in 1286, when the King of Scotland, Alexander III, fell off his horse and broke his neck, leaving no proper heir. All of his sons had died earlier, but there was a glimmer of hope since he had one surviving granddaughter, which his daughter Margaret of Scotland had had with the King of Norway, Eric II. The problem was that this girl, known as Margaret Maid of Norway, lived in Scandinavia and was just 3 years old. In light of this, the nobility decided to establish a council of 6 guardians of Scotland until the child grew up, which was a good compromise to keep the peace between the two most powerful families in Scotland, the Balliols and the Bruces, both descendants of previous kings. Unfortunately, that solution was short-lived because a few years later, in 1290, little Margaret died as she was making her way to Scotland to be crowned.
It's a tragedy, a real tragedy.
This led to the Great Cause, a bizarre situation in which 13 different claimants to the throne came forward. Fearing a civil war, the Guardians of Scotland asked Edward I to resolve the dispute, since Margaret had been betrothed to his son. The main candidates were John Balliol, son of an English noble who had fought beside Edward's father Henry III, and Robert de Bruce, who had gone on the 9th Crusade along with Edward and his brother. But here is when Edward the Longshanks began to earn his other nickname, Hammer of the Scots, demanding to be recognised as feudal overlord of Scotland before he would step in as arbiter. After a process which lasted nearly 2 years, John Balliol was elected as new King of Scotland, but things didn't go very well for him because, for starters, he had to pay homage to Edward. And then it all became much worse as England began to raise taxes and demand soldiers for its campaign against France. Eventually, the Scots became fed up and decided to ally with the French. Perhaps Edward had even sought this from the beginning because it gave him the perfect excuse to invade Scotland, kicking off the First War of Scottish Independence in 1296. The cities of Berwick and Edinburgh swiftly fell into English hands, and, after the Battle of Dunbar, John Balliol was made to abdicate and imprisoned at the Tower of London. Edward I thus became ruler of Scotland, and it's at this point we have to start spoiling the fun for those who believed that Braveheart was remotely realistic. Feel free to tell us how glad or disappointed you are in the comments section.
Oh, it wouldn't do you much good, I can't read.
To begin with, the film shows the conflict starting in 1280, after the death of the Scottish king Alexander III, which is totally wrong, as we've just seen. Yes, we understand that it's a fictional film, not a documentary, so they're allowed to make up whatever they want to fit the story, but we also believe it's important to know what's true and what isn't.
William Wallace is 7 feet tall!
The first Scottish rebellion was led by the young Robert the Bruce, grandson of the previously mentioned Robert de Bruce, but he didn't last for very long and ended up submitting to the English. That was when a resistance movement emerged, led by William Wallace, and also Andrew de Murray, although he was left out of the film for some reason. It seems that Wallace was the son of a landowner in Ayrshire, so although he wasn't part of the high nobility, the guy certainly didn't grow up in a prehistoric-looking hut in the middle of nowhere. It's not 100% clear how his beef with the English began. One version of the story goes that one day, the English High Sheriff of Lanark demanded some taxes from his family and, since they couldn't pay, he killed them all. Others say that his lands were taken from him. Either way, the film's depiction is certainly not true. First of all, because there are no definitive records about him having a wife, it seems this was added to the story several centuries later, but more importantly, the whole deal with prima noctis, whereby feudal lords had the right to sleep with any woman on their wedding night, is total drivel. Again, total drivel. Anyway, whatever the reason, the point is that Wallace really wanted to murder some Englishmen, so he sieged Lanark Fort and killed the High Sheriff. He then fled to the forests where he joined Andrew de Murray's group of rebels. Together they defeated the army at the famous Battle of Stirling Bridge. Yep, you heard it right. It's called that because the key to the battle was a bridge, which the Scots took advantage of in order to manoeuvre the English into a bottleneck and massacre them. But I guess that wouldn't have looked very epic in a film. Oh, and the Scots also didn't paint their faces blue, that was a Pict thing from several centuries earlier, and neither did they wear kilts, those appeared several centuries later. In reality, they wore armour and basically looked like any other medieval army. Back in the real world, although Andrew de Murray died from his wounds, this battle was a huge victory for the Scottish rebels, and William was named Guardian of Scotland. He continued fighting against the English, but was not able to take any enemy castles, and he certainly never conquered York. Then, in 1298, he faced King Edward himself at the Battle of Falkirk, where the Scottish troops were defeated. One account says that the Scottish nobility ordered a retreat of the cavalry when they realised the day was lost, while others believe it was a planned betrayal, because they were jealous of a pleb like Wallace being named Guardian of Scotland. However, there isn't much evidence of this second version, and even less that the traitor was Robert the Bruce as shown in the film, mainly because he wasn't even present at that battle. Oh, and the film also shows a company of Irishmen who joined the Scottish army to fight English oppression. Totally made up, sorry, didn't happen. After this harsh defeat, the Scottish resistance moved to the Highlands, where they held out for several years. Eventually, Edward managed to take control of Scotland, following the siege of Stirling Castle, the last key stronghold. In order to take the castle, the English built a massive trebuchet nicknamed Warwolf, which is a pretty scary name to be fair. It is shown at the start of the film Outlaw King, where we also see how Robert the Bruce and Edward became besties, but that peace didn't last very long.
King's terms, they'll never live up to them.
Soon afterwards, William Wallace was betrayed and handed over to the English. It is told that the king ordered him to be castrated and disemboweled alive, and then quartered, with his limbs sent to be displayed at different northern towns. Yep, Edward was pretty nasty with his enemies. Robert the Bruce then rose up as leader of Scotland. He initially had some competition in the figure of John Comyn, another powerful noble who had also previously claimed the Scottish throne. But in 1306, Bruce met with him at Greyfriars Kirk in Dumfries and ended up killing Comyn, so he was finally crowned King of Scotland at Scone in 1306. However, because of the English invasion and conflicts with other Scottish factions, He then had to flee to the Hebrides. By the way, if you like this character, there is a film from 2019 called Robert the Bruce, which tells his story. You might even consider it a sequel to Braveheart, since Robert is played by the same actor. Rumour has it that he subscribed to this channel and always upvotes our videos, and we encourage you to follow his example. And now we have to leave Scotland and return to England for a while, because some big changes were afoot. In 1307, the hammer of the Scots broke. As he was travelling north to continue fighting the Scots, King Edward Longshanks contracted dysentery and died. Upon Edward Longshanks' death, his fourth son, Edward of Carnarvon, was crowned as Edward II, the new King of England. The first thing he did was cool down the tension with France, and for that he married a daughter of the French King Philip IV, the fair Isabella, who came to be known as the She-Wolf of France. Pretty cool. Once again, Braveheart shows how Wallace and Isabella had a fling in sunny Scotland, but logically this couldn't have happened because she never set a foot in Britain until 1308, 3 years after Wallace's execution. Plus, she was just 13 years old at the time. However, although it wasn't with Wallace, she really did betray her husband, as we will soon see. What is accurate is that Edward II and Isabella did not get on too well, mainly because the king maintained a very close relationship with the Earl of Cornwall, Piers Gaveston. While it's not 100% clear what these two got up to in private, it is certainly true that Gaveston became a very influential figure in Edward's entourage. It is also said he was very arrogant and mocked the nobles, giving them ridiculous nicknames, so they quickly became fed up and started plotting to get rid of him, as nobles tend to do. In the film, this is resolved when the character, which they renamed Philip for some reason, is defenestrated, another fancy word meaning thrown out of a window. But the reality is that in 1308, several barons, led by the king's cousin Thomas of Lancaster, pressured Edward and eventually had Gaveston exiled to Ireland, although the king managed to bring him back the following year. This was not the only aspect in which Edward II was different from his father. He had a far weaker character and was easily influenced, so the nobility didn't trust him very much. This is why, once again led by Thomas of Lancaster, they eventually presented Edward with the Ordinances of 1311, which significantly diluted his power. Among other things, he would now require Parliament's approval to grant lands, declare war, and even leave the country.
What makes you think you can treat me like a child?
The nobles also took this opportunity to finally get rid of Gaveston. They captured, judged and executed him, and the king got so mad with Thomas of Lancaster that he began to plan a war against him and other agitators. However, after some mediation by the King of France and the Pope, everyone kissed and made up in 1313. And now we return to Scotland, where Robert the Bruce's rebellion had flared up once again. The Scottish king had taken advantage of the change in England's throne to regain several castles in the north. One notable event was the Battle of Loudon Hill in 1307, where just about 500 Scots defeated a 3,000-strong English army, thanks to trenches and traps they set up in a marshy terrain, which took out their cavalry. After this, the only major castle left under English control was the one at Stirling, which the Scots sieged in 1313. In 1314, once he finally got his court in order, Edward II sent a large army up north to meet Robert the Bruce at the Battle of Bannockburn, where it was crushed with 200 English knights killed and many others made prisoners. After this sound defeat, Edward retreated from Scotland, while at the same time, this and other battles earned Robert the Bruce an interesting nickname after death: Braveheart. Bet you didn't see that one coming, did you? As we explained before, Edward II was easily influenced by those around him, and now that Gaveston was out of the picture, that vacuum was filled by the Despencer family, particularly Hugh Despencer the elder and Hugh Despencer the younger. The latter especially as he became Royal Chamberlain, the king's right hand, helping Edward to improve the economy following the Scottish debacle. Hugh then began to accumulate more and more power. History was repeating itself. To complicate matters further, that period saw the Great Famine. It was a time of constant torrential rain and very cold temperatures, which led to crop failures, food shortages, and huge death rates. In the year 1321, many nobles became fed up with Hugh the Younger's influence in court, and a civil war broke out, known as the Despencer War. On the rebel side, there was the king's old frenemy, Thomas of Lancaster, and especially Roger Mortimer, Earl of March, who will play a key role in future events. Eventually, Parliament forced the king to get rid of Despencer. To dispense with Dispenser, thank you.
You see what I did there?
But his exile didn't last very long at all, as he quickly garnered new supporters and returned to England, where he managed to put down the rebellion in 1322. Thomas of Lancaster was executed, and Roger Mortimer was jailed at the Tower of London, although a year later he managed to escape and flee to France. This was the beginning of the end for King Edward II. Let's see how it came about. The current King of France was Charles IV, brother to Edward's wife Isabella, she-wolf of France, who was completely fed up of her husband and the damn dispenser, since rumour said he treated her like a maid, had his wife spy on her, and seized her lands. At one point, Edward II sent Isabella to France along with the delegation, and she decided to stay there, first playing dumb and later asking for her son, Prince Edward, to be sent over. As you can probably imagine, something was afoot. It turned out that Isabella had met up and got involved with the fugitive Roger Mortimer, and together they began to plan how to take over England, using the prince and with support from other exiled English nobles. In 1326, Roger Mortimer led a fleet of nearly 100 ships to England. They landed at Orwell and were soon joined by several more English nobles, including Henry of Lancaster and the king's half-brother Edmund of Woodstock. After taking Bristol Castle, the rebels captured and killed Hugh Despencer the Elder, while the king and Hugh the Younger took refuge in Wales. They were soon captured as well, whereupon Hugh the Younger was tortured and executed in the William Wallace style, while King Edward was forced to abdicate in his son. He was then locked up and died a few months later under unclear circumstances. Bloody murder. He was killed. Murder. At the age of 15, Edward III, or Edward of Windsor, became King of England and went on to rule for the next half-century, between 1327 and 1377. During his early reign, little Eddie, or rather his mum and Roger Mortimer, managed to restore the power that the crown had lost in previous years, and everything seemed to be going well in the Kingdom of England. In 1328, Isabella and Mortimer made peace with Robert the Bruce and signed the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton. This put an end to the First War of Scottish Independence, which had lasted for 32 years. This also recognised Robert the Bruce as King of Scotland, and hereinafter they left him to rule in relative peace. A little bit later, in 1330, Edward began having trouble with Mortimer, allegedly because he was dipping his hands into the treasury. Eventually, Edward went after him, sieging Nottingham Castle, where his men took advantage of a secret tunnel to enter the fortress and catch him unawares.
I just came through the unsecure back door.
Mortimer was then judged and executed, and with him out of the way, Edward III was able to rule unimpeded, which he did pretty well. He travelled all over England to understand the problems of common folk firsthand and organised many jousts and tournaments to recreate tales like the legend of King Arthur, which had become very fashionable at the time. But then, 1332 saw the outbreak of the Second War of Scottish Independence. This came about through an old rivalry. You see, Scotland was ruled by the son of Robert the Bruce, David II, but the son of his old enemy John Balliol, Edward Balliol, wanted to usurp the throne and requested support from England's Edward III. At the Battle of Halidon Hill in 1333, the English defeated David II's troops and he had to flee to France, leaving Edward Balliol to be crowned as the new King of Scotland. And since we mentioned France, let's open that can of worms now. In the year 1328, French King Charles IV died, and without a proper heir since he had no children or brothers. Given the situation, King Edward III considered that he had a claim to the French throne, since his mother Isabella was Charles's sister, but the French aristocracy laughed him off, saying, "Mais non, Edouard, you must be joking, and then placed Charles's cousin, Philip VI, as King of France, giving rise to the Valois dynasty. Henry III couldn't do much about this, so he accepted begrudgingly, but it didn't take very long for trouble to arise, specifically over the territory of Gascony. This tension eventually led to the famous 100 Years' War, fought between England and France. Actually, it lasted for over 116 years, but that doesn't sound nearly as catchy.
Nitpicking nerds.
Just a quick note to let you know that we aren't going to go into too much detail about this conflict, since we intend to make a series on the history of France, and this war took place on French soil. So today we'll only be mentioning the most relevant events to our story. Although the war was declared in 1337, the English didn't actually start attacking France until 1340, when they won an encounter at Sluys, which gave them control over the English Channel, thus preventing France from launching a counter-invasion. However, the first great land clash in this war was the Battle of Crécy, which took place in 1346. It is said that this was the first significant battle in which Europeans used cannons, even though they were still very rudimentary. Instead, the main differential aspect in this war were the English archers. One very important participant in this battle was the English king's son, Edward of Woodstock, Prince of Wales, generally known as the Black Prince. He was called this because he wore a dark armour, not because he was secretly adopted. Meanwhile, in the far north, King David II returned to Scotland and supported his French allies by attacking England, leading to the Battle of Neville's Cross in 1346. Henry III won that encounter and captured David, who was locked up for the next 12 years. Then, just when it looked like Edward would fulfil the Plantagenet ambition of gaining control over the Kingdom of Scotland, a tiny obstacle messed up his plans. We're talking really small here, microscopic actually, for it was a bacteria. We're referring, of course, to the Black Death. Oh my God! Once again, this is such a broad topic that it merits its own separate video, but in this case, we've already made that one. It was our first video, and although it's not our best because we were still figuring many things out, you might enjoy it nevertheless. For now, suffice to say that the Black Death was arguably the most devastating pandemic in human history, as it killed approximately 100 million people between 1346 and 1353. Naturally, the 100 Years' War was interrupted several times throughout this period, and yet, bizarrely, England continued to hold tournaments, like the one that took place in Windsor in 1349, when the king created the Order of the Garter, inspired by Arthurian myths, in an attempt to unite the nobility. By 1355, England was starting to recover from the plague, so Edward III sent his son, the Black Prince, to Gascony. He obtained great military victories, but these were accompanied by horrible sackings and murder. The Black Prince then advanced towards the north, moving towards the Loire River and laying waste to everything he found along the way. Near Poitiers, the French King John II came out to fight him, but was defeated and captured along with his son. This led to the Treaty of Britannia, signed in 1360, which put an end to the first phase of the war. At this point, England had France held by the shortened curlies.
Oh, sacre bleu!
Moreover, the Second War of Scottish Independence also ended right around this time, specifically in the year 1357. King David II was freed after paying a hefty ransom, and he reclaimed the throne of Scotland from the regent who had ruled in his absence, his nephew Robert Stewart. Later, in 1371, the king died without an heir, and Robert became the new King of Scotland, founding the Stuart dynasty.
Back and forth, back and forth.
Now that the actual war between England and France had ceased, in 1366, the conflict between them moved to the Kingdom of Castile. To give you some context, this was the domain of King Pedro I, or King Pedro the Cruel, that is, until a rebellion erupted led by his bastard half-brother Enrique of Trastamara, or Enrico the Fratricidal, for reasons that will soon become obvious. The King of France, Charles V, sent a group of mercenaries led by Bertrand de Guesclin to support the usurper Enrique, while the Black Prince and his brother John of Gaunt and their Gascon troops disembarked in the Iberian Peninsula to support King Pedro. Together they obtained a noble victory at the Battle of Nayera in 1367, but after that they had a fallout because Pedro said to the Black Prince, "Actually, I can't pay you, and in fact I'm not even going to give you the lordship of Biscay as we had agreed. Sorry, amigo." So the English left.
I could give you my word as a Spaniard.
No good. I've known too many Spaniards.
In 1369, Enrique of Trastamara managed to kill Pedro the Cruel and became the new King of Castile. Thanks to the support of King Charles of France, the Castilian fleet became one of the most powerful in Europe, and at this point it turned against England, achieving a great triumph at the Battle of La Rochelle in 1372. England then sought a naval ally and turned to Portugal, leading to the Truce of Bruges, signed in 1375. By then, things weren't looking too good for the English, as they only maintained their hold on Calais and a narrow strip of land going from Bordeaux to Bayonne, and far from improving, Plantagenet fortunes were about to take a turn for the worse, because both Edward III and his son the Black Prince fell ill and died. At this point, the English crown went to the Black Prince's son, Richard II, or Richard of Bordeaux. Since he was just a 10-year-old kid, Parliament sought to prevent his uncle, John of Gaunt, from usurping the throne, and so instead of appointing him as a single regent, they decided that a council of nobles would rule. As you can see, Parliament gained considerable power in these times, and it is worth noting the rise of the commons, comprised by burghers and small landowners, who began to make their voices heard. All this time, the 100 Years' War had been at a relative standstill, since the French also had a child sitting on their throne, Charles VI, or Charles the Beloved, after his father had passed. In addition, both kingdoms had been forced to raise taxes considerably to pay for the war, and that had led to discontent and numerous revolts, particularly by peasants who were quite fed up with the situation. The most notable was the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, or Rebellion of Wat Tyler, when the rebels managed to seize the Tower of London. But just when things looked to be getting out of control, young King Richard managed to stop the revolt by making several promises and concessions. He would later break all of them like a true statesman, but the key point is that the rebellion was resolved. Oh, and that Wat Tyler guy ended up being executed, of course. Although neither Richard II nor the English people had much appetite for war, several nobles who were lining their pockets thanks to the conflict with France started to cause tension in Parliament. In 1387, 5 important earls, including the king's uncle Thomas of Woodstock and his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, Earl of Derby, formed an alliance against Richard. These lot, known as the Lords Appellant, staged a coup and took control of the royal council following the Battle of Radcock Bridge. Then they exiled or executed Richard's councillors and allies. It was a total purge, but at least he managed to keep his life and even the throne.
I realize it could be so much worse.
Throughout the following decade, Richard II continued to be the king in name, while the real power was wielded by the Lords Appellant. So instead he turned his attention towards architecture, painting and literature. He hosted parties attended by renowned poets like Geoffrey Chaucer, and he also ordered an extensive rebuilding of Westminster Hall, which by then had become the seat of Parliament. One figure whom we should mention is John Wycliffe, a theologian from Oxford University who founded the Lollards movement. He argued against the church's riches and worship of images, rejected celibacy, wars, violence and several other important precepts at the time. For many, Wycliffe was the spiritual father of the Hussites and even the Protestant Reformation. But now it's back to the action, because despite living for several years in a state of relative calm, King Richard II always harboured a deep desire for revenge against the rebels. And he obviously heard it's a dish best served cold because he waited for almost a decade.
For a very long time.
To give you a quick idea of what went down, it covered the last 2 years of his reign, and they are known as the Tyranny of Richard II. His vengeance began in 1397, when he accused all the Lords Appellant of conspiracy and treated them just like they had done with his allies, exiling some and executing others. 2 of the exiles were Thomas Mowbray and his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, with the latter receiving an insult to go with the injury, as the king expropriated all his family's possessions upon the death of his father, John of Gaunt. However, that turned out to be a huge mistake, because in 1399, when Richard II sailed to Ireland in order to quell a rebellion, Henry Bolingbroke took advantage of the king's absence to disembark in England and claim his rightful inheritance. Then, seeing that not only was he not met with any resistance, in fact many people were joining his cause, Henry got all cocky and made a play for the throne. And so it happened that when Richard finally returned, he found that the country had been taken away from him. he was forced to meet with Henry at Flint Castle and abdicate in exchange for his life, whereupon he was locked up at Pontefract Castle, although he died very soon afterwards. And by died, I mean he was killed, which is usually what happened to anyone surrendering a crown in the Middle Ages.
You can't prove anything.
Parliament then appointed Henry Bolingbroke as the new king, Henry IV, thus putting an end to the direct line of the Plantagenet kings, since he belonged to one of its scions, the House of Lancaster. This ushered in a fascinating period, which we will cover in the next episode, our last about the history of medieval England, which will see the resolution of the 100 Years' War, and also how the Plantagenet cadet branches of Lancaster and York fought over the throne in a brutal civil war with a very pretty name, which Game of Thrones was based on, the War of the Roses. In the previous episode, we saw how, after being exiled, Henry Bolingbroke managed to regroup, invade England, and force his cousin, King Richard II, to abdicate. Afterwards, Parliament crowned him as Henry IV of Lancaster, giving rise to the Lancaster Dynasty, a cadet branch of the Plantagenet family. Because he was considered as an illegitimate ruler by many noblemen, Henry had to put up with constant rebellions. Among his main opponents were two brothers, the Earl of Northumberland, Henry Percy, and his brother, the Earl of Worcester, Thomas Percy. And also there was Henry Hotspur, son of the former. They all belonged to the Percy family, who started out as close allies of the king, until everything changed after the Battle of Holmenden Hill. At this encounter, the Percys defended England from Scotland, but at one point they asked for support, and the king left them high and dry.
Don't hold a personal grudge just because you lost.
To make matters worse, a rebel leader named Owain Glendower had arisen in Wales. He is famous for adopting the Red Dragon flag for Wales. The guy was proclaimed Prince of Wales by his followers and began a guerrilla war all over the Welsh territory. Initially he was quite successful, but later his luck turned, and the last anyone saw of him was when he fled and hid in the forests. Eventually, Henry IV managed to quell the Percy rebellion. Henry Hotspur died in battle, and Thomas Percy was executed. Henry Percy surrendered and was pardoned, but in 1405 he rebelled once more, this time with the support of the Archbishop of York, Richard Scrope. In fact, most of the north rose against the king, but Henry IV managed to put everyone in their place and then got rid of the Archbishop. Surprisingly, Henry Percy surrendered and was pardoned once again, and unsurprisingly, he rebelled once again.
Well, it's Groundhog Day.
On this occasion, he obtained support from the Kingdom of Scotland, whom he had recently fought against. Go figure. This rebellion ended in 1408 with the Battle of Bramham Moor, where Henry Percy was killed. All of these uprisings, together with the adverse economic times, weighed heavily on King Henry IV, and his health declined until, in 1413, he keeled over and died during a parliament session. He was then succeeded by his son, Henry V, whose reign was relatively short, just about 10 years. Nevertheless, he is well regarded due to his excellent relationship with the nobility in Parliament, his good handling of public money, and for being a firm but not tyrannical king.
And well endowed.
The first significant conflict of his rule was with the Lollards, who began to conspire against him, led by John Oldcastle. This man was supposedly a close friend of Henry, so when the king found out about his involvement in the plot, he was furious and had him captured and executed. The story goes that he was spit roasted like a pig, but maybe that's just a myth. Certainly not a pretty image. Without a doubt, the main concern throughout Henry V's life was the ongoing conflict with France, the 100 Years' War. The situation was at a standstill when he rose to power, since there had been a truce between England and France, which had lasted for several years. In addition, there was also some uncertainty surrounding the French crown around that time, as it was held by Charles VI, who suffered from mental issues and psychotic episodes.
Oh, he's slow.
This led to a big kerfuffle over the regency until eventually Jean le Semper, or John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, managed to take power. In light of this mess, Henry V decided to make a move, and in 1415 he disembarked at Harfleur in Normandy with a massive army. From there, he marched on to Calais, and a few days later faced the French forces at the Battle of Agincourt, one of the bloodiest in the entire war. Being on their home soil, the French were vastly superior in numbers. However, heavy rains had turned the battlefield into a bog, which became a deadly trap for the excellent French cavalry and enabled the English longbows to make short work of them. As an interesting side note, the story goes that this battle gave rise to a particular English finger gesture, and it's directly related to the longbow. Apparently, when the French captured an English soldier, they cut off his index and middle fingers so that he wouldn't be able to use the bow anymore. And so before the battle, the English soldiers used to taunt the enemy by showing them their two fingers as if to say,
"Here are our fingers, come and get them, you bastards."
Now back to the story. After his overwhelming victory at Agincourt, Henry had all the prisoners executed. Well, except the nobles, of course, since he could get some hefty ransoms for them. Then, his next objective was the Norman city of Caen, which surrendered after a couple of weeks of being sieged and pummeled by the English artillery. After that came Rouen in 1419, and with it Henry V took control of all Normandy. By this point, the French were in total panic mode and fighting amongst themselves. So in 1420, Philip the Good, son and successor of John the Fearless, arranged the Treaty of Troyes, whereby Henry V was recognised as regent and heir to the French throne, as long as both kingdoms were not annexed and each maintained its own institutions, customs and laws.
No further contact!
The deal was then sealed by Henry's marriage to the French princess Catherine of Valois. Of course, the treaty also meant that the current French king's son, Charles the Dauphin, meaning Dolphin, which was the title of the French heir for some reason, would be disinherited. As you can imagine, the Dolphin didn't take this well. He threw a strop and fled to Bourges, where he set up a parallel rebel court. In spite of this, everything appeared to be going really well for Henry V. He married Catherine and the following year had their first child, also called Henry, who was set to inherit the crowns of both England and France, thus completing the old ambition of his great-great-great-grandfather, Edward Longshanks, of rebuilding the old Angevin Empire. However, as often happens, just when it seemed things were perfectly lined up, the gods of chance got bored and decided to throw in a few wild cards. For starters, in 1422, Henry V fell ill and died at the young age of 35. If he had lasted just a couple of months longer, he would have survived the mad French king, Charles VI, and taken his crown. As it was, his son became King Henry VI of England, but since he was barely a year old, the power was wielded by a regency council, led mainly by his uncle John, Duke of Bedford, along with Henry Beaufort, half-brother of Henry IV, and son of the king's grandfather John of Gaunt, who at the time was Lord Chancellor and Bishop of Winchester. Another important regent was Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, another of Henry's uncles. Got all that? Good.
Now, does everyone understand, or do I have to repeat myself?
Over in France, the Armagnac faction, supporters of Charles the Dauphin, took advantage of this transition in power to proclaim him as King Charles VII, which was kind of troublesome, as this meant France now had two different kings, since the Treaty of Troyes said that Henry VI of England was the rightful heir. Over the following years, the English forces occupied Paris and most of the north, and by 1429 the Duke of Bedford had managed to reach and lay siege to the key rebel city of Orleans. At this point, everything seemed to indicate that the conflict was going to be resolved and Henry would be triumphant, but just at that moment, another historical wildcard came into play, this time in the form of a brave young girl who rose up out of nowhere to change the course of history. We are of course talking about Joan of Arc, a French peasant who turned up at the court of Chinon to tell Charles the Dauphin that she had heard a voice, supposedly from God, ordering her to stop the invaders at Orleans. And she also said that you should like this video, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment. Weird. Charles replied, "This is fantastic, mon chéri. Here, take this armor and a handful of soldiers and go and kill all the English." It's unclear whether Charles really placed any hopes on her, but shockingly, young Joan managed to not only stop the siege of Orleans, but force the Duke of Bedford to retreat. Later, Joan accompanied the Dauphin to Reims, where he was crowned as King Charles VII of France in 1429. Unfortunately, the following year, Joan was captured by the other French faction, the Burgundians, who handed her over to their English allies. They made an example of her, burning her alive at a public square in Rouen, and later held a coronation for young Henry VI as King of France at the Parisian Cathedral of Notre Dame. Joan of Arc's death reinvigorated the Armagnac faction, and they began to beat back the English. Seeing the writing on the wall, the Burgundians decided to switch sides and join the Armagnac. They signed the Treaty of Arras in 1435, and then marched hand in hand to retake Paris, which they achieved in 1436.
Paris, France?
Henry VI, who at that point was still a young lad, was quite overwhelmed by these events and began to lose more and more territories. Unfortunately for England, he had quite a weak character and was definitely not cut out to be a great leader. Instead, right around this time, his uncles, the regents, began to squabble among themselves until the Duke of Suffolk, William de la Pole, prevailed and got himself appointed Chamberlain and Admiral of England. He then organised a peace treaty with France and sealed it with Henry's marriage to the French king's niece, Margaret of Anjou, in 1444, who would eventually give him a son, Edward of Westminster. But after that, William de la Pole didn't last much longer in court because he had kept hidden an essential part of the deal, which was giving up Maine and Anjou among other things. He was heavily criticised and sought to flee into exile, but instead he was captured and decapitated. To make matters worse, a soldier of Irish descent called Jack Cade started a rebellion against Henry in Kent. The rebels marched towards London, destroying everything as they went. But happily, Queen Margaret intervened to take control of the situation. She promised a royal pardon to any rebels who backed off and disbanded peacefully, and many of them took up the offer, abandoning Cade, who was then swiftly arrested and, executed. At this time there was also a little scandal in the kingdom which we must mention because it would later have a massive historical impact, and also because who doesn't like a bit of gossip. The king's mother, the widow Catherine of Valois, who had been isolated in court by the regents, began a romance with a Welsh nobleman in her service named Owen Tudor. Together they had several children, the most important of whom was Edmund. He married Lady Margaret Beaufort, who had Lancaster blood running through her veins, since she was the great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt, and therefore could carry a claim to the throne. At the time of marriage, Edmund was 25 and Margaret was 11, but that didn't really mean much in medieval times, so the marriage was consummated immediately, resulting in the birth of Henry Tudor. Little could anyone have imagined that that boy would eventually become King of England.
What a beautiful story.
Yeah.
But that wouldn't happen for another 30 years, so for now let's just keep in mind the name of Tudor and get back to our story. The last phase of the 100 Years' War began in 1449, when Charles VII launched a double attack on Normandy and Guyenne, leading to the Battle of Fourmigny in 1450. The French won the day and thus regained Normandy after 30 years of English occupation. And then, 3 years later, the same happened with Guyenne, following the Battle of Castillon. With these two victories, France finally recovered all the territory that had been under English control for 300 years.
And because France is France.
This also put an end to the 100 Years' War, since Henry VI's troops were kicked out of French territory, although technically they still held the port of Calais, which remained in English hands for a little while longer. The year was 1453 and the 100 Years' War was finally over. Hooray! At long last, England would be able to enjoy peace and prosperity. From now on, everything would be fantastic, just like in a Disney film, right? No, wrong. Sorry, wrong. If you've been following this series, by now you will have noticed that English history is basically an endless carousel of internal fighting and civil wars, and that hasn't really changed, but at least nowadays the rivalry is played out on the football pitches. The peace didn't last very long, as the next conflict erupted just 2 years later in 1455. This was the War of the Roses, which lasted for 32 years and was fought by the two cadet branches of the Plantagenet dynasty that had sprouted from Henry III nearly 2 centuries earlier. On one side was the House of Lancaster, initially descended from Edmund of Lancaster, brother of Edward Longshanks, and then reinforced by John of Gaunt and Henry Bolingbroke. At that time, they held power and comprised the royal family of Henry VI, and also Edmund Beaufort, Earl of Somerset. Their symbol was a red rose. On the other side was the House of York, descended from both Edmund of Langley, Duke of York, and also Lionel of Antwerp. At that time it was headed by Richard of York, a powerful noble who fought in the war against France. Its badge was a white rose. Some historians argue that rather than one big long war, there were several smaller ones, but we're not going to delve into these little technicalities because there's a heap of stuff to get through as it is, so let's begin. In 1453, Henry VI was so depressed by the defeat in France that he suffered a psychological meltdown which lasted for nearly 2 years, during which he was mostly catatonic and did not understand anything or recognise anyone, even failing to respond to the birth of his son, Edward. Ironically, this malady, triggered by the defeat in France, came from his mother's side, which was the French one.
Oh, sacre bleu!
Evidently, having a vegetable as the head of state is far from ideal, as the UK people still well know today. So it was his resourceful wife, Margaret of Anjou, who wore the trousers around the royal palace, although of course trousers hadn't been invented, so she wore the tights, I guess, that the men used to wear. She wore tights. Margaret was in charge, is what I'm saying, and she was supported by Edmund Beaufort, Earl of Somerset. The main problem was that the most powerful noble in England, Richard, Duke of York, hated Edmund and also sought to gain influence over the king. So Richard stood before Parliament, accused Edmund of treason and had him arrested. After this, he was appointed Lord Protector of England, especially because in the absence of a strong king, the other nobles preferred to have one of their own in charge, rather than an upstart foreigner, particularly a French one, let alone a woman.
Inconceivable!
Richard of York was married to Cecily Neville, whose family was one of the richest in England at the time, and also descended from John of Gaunt, so it had very blue blood. And if you have blue blood, please speak to your doctor. In addition, Cecily's nephew was Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, who played a very important role in the upcoming conflict, when he supported Richard of York, so much so that he would come to be known as the Kingmaker. For their part, the Nevilles had an ongoing feud with the Percy family, to whom they were related, but who supported the royalist faction, that is, the House of Lancaster. In fact, between 1453 and 1454, the Nevilles and Percys fought a small-scale war with their private armies which wreaked havoc in northern England. Eventually, after nearly 2 years, Henry VI recovered from his stupor, or basilisk stare, or whatever it was. Urged by his wife Margaret, he freed Edmund Beaufort, and together they kicked out Richard of York from the regency. However, although the king had managed to bring peace for the time being, this intervention made enemies of the House of York and the Neville family. Therefore, we could argue that this was the initial trigger of the War of the Roses. Being an ambitious man, Richard of York wanted to regain his position, and so he travelled to London to politely persuade the king, accompanied by an army. The first encounter was the Battle of St Albans in 1455, where the Yorkists managed to kill the leader of the Lancastrian side, Edmund Beaufort, and also Henry Percy, Earl of Northumbria. To make it even worse, Henry VI had hidden nearby when he saw his forces being defeated, but was eventually found and captured. As you'll see, this will become a common occurrence with Henry. With no other alternative, he became a puppet in the hands of Richard of York, who was then reappointed Lord Protector. This split the country into two halves. One was controlled by the House of Lancaster, with a parliament which met at Coventry, right in the middle of the country, and the other, comprising most of the rest of England, was controlled by the House of York, with a parliament that met in London. But of course, King Henry VI didn't like being in the hands of those pesky Yorkists, so he went about getting support from some important nobles. Eventually, it all came to a head in 1459 at the Battle of Ludford Bridge. There, the king's army managed to defeat Richard of York and his ally, Richard Neville, who ended up fleeing to Ireland and Calais, respectively. But this wasn't the end, far from it. Neville, who was very rich, regrouped and returned to England the following year, fighting the royal army at the Battle of Northampton. This time, he was victorious and managed to capture the king once again. By this point, Richard of York had decided that he wasn't going to settle for being Lord Protector anymore, and instead wanted to become king. But Parliament wasn't too enthusiastic about this, and plus it wasn't really legal. However, both houses managed to reach a compromise. Henry VI would be allowed to continue ruling, but his son, Edmund of Westminster, would not be the heir. Instead, upon the king's death, the crown would go to a member of the House of York, either Richard or maybe his son, the Earl of March, who was also named, you guessed it, Edward.
I've heard that name somewhere before.
Predictably, this agreement upset the Queen, Margaret of Anjou, who probably said something along the lines of, "If these English pigs think they can force me to disinherit my son, they have another thing coming," and took Edward to Scotland, where she managed to put together a Lancastrian army. In 1460, Margaret's loyalist troops travelled south and met the Yorkist forces at the Battle of Wakefield. This time the House of Lancaster prevailed, and Richard of York was captured and executed. His powers then went to his 18-year-old son, Edward of March, who turned out to be just as ambitious as his dad. The first thing he did was to join up with his father's main ally, Richard Neville, the Kingmaker. Together they reorganised the battered forces of the House of York and mounted a new campaign, defeating the Loyalists in 1461 at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross. One notable victim of this battle was Owen Tudor, the second husband of the former Queen Catherine of Valois, who was captured and killed by the House of York. Queen Margaret of Anjou then launched a counterattack and was victorious at the Second Battle of St Albans. She managed to rescue her husband, King Henry VI, from the prison where he was being held, and together they returned to the north. Meanwhile, in London, Edward of March got himself crowned as King Edward IV in 1461. The House of York had finally managed to take the English throne, but Margaret would not give up so easily. She sought to recover her family's rightful domains, and that led to the Battle of Towton in Yorkshire, which is arguably the largest and bloodiest encounter ever fought on English soil. It took place during a frightful gale and claimed the lives of most of the key nobles from northern territories who had sided with the House of Lancaster. The House of York won the day and consolidated their power, while the Lancastrians had to run away to Scotland. Edward IV of York then ruled England for the following 22 years, although there was a small interruption when Henry VI managed to regain the throne for a short while. Let's see how it happened. Throughout the 1460s, the House of Lancaster, supported by the Percy family, sought to regain power, but a sound defeat at the Battle of Hexham in 1464 finally put an end to that resistance. Moreover, a few months later, Henry VI was captured once again and locked up in the Tower of London. By this point, it appeared that the House of York had finally prevailed and all the unrest would soon be over. Edward IV ruled England without any opposition. He was handsome, charismatic, smart, educated, and a bit of a womanizer and a drunkard too, but hey, nobody's perfect. Anyway, things were definitely going great for him, so what spoiled it all? Well, it so happened that his main ally, the Kingmaker Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, was also a very ambitious man, even though he preferred wielding power in the shadows. Neville had placed one of his brothers as the Archbishop of York and another as the Earl of Northumberland, after he got rid of his old enemies, the Percy family. But this wasn't nearly enough for Neville, he wanted much more. In particular, he tried to make King Edward marry an important French lady who benefited his interests, and so he brokered a deal with the King of France. But instead, Edward ignored him and secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, a minor noble whose family had actually sided with the House of Lancaster in the past. Under her influence, the king began to favour the Woodville family with important positions in his court, land and key marriages, which gradually undermined Richard Neville's power. Then, in 1469, an insurrection broke out in the north against the Woodvilles. The leader was a mysterious figure named Robin of Redesdale, but it's thought that this was all orchestrated by Richard Neville in an attempt to regain power by getting rid of the king. In fact, he had also allied with Edward's brother, George, Duke of Clarence, and together they triumphed at the Battle of Edgecote, where Neville managed to capture King Edward IV and lock him up at Middleham Castle. Of course, despite being known as the Kingmaker, Neville didn't really have any authority to go around imprisoning kings, so eventually, under pressure from Parliament and many other nobles, he was forced to free Edward IV. He then ran away to France, to the court of King Louis XI, where he met up with his old rival, Margaret of Anjou, and her son, Edward of Westminster. These former enemies now had some common ground and became allies, in a bid to dethrone Edward IV of York. Together with some French support, their armies disembarked in England in 1471 and forced Edward IV to flee to Burgundy, since his sister Margaret had married its ruler, Duke Charles the Bold. Once in control of England, Margaret of Anjou freed her husband, Henry VI of Lancaster, and put him back on the throne, but it was really Richard Neville who pulled the strings. However, this situation didn't last very long because the exiled Edward IV returned to England with the support of his brother-in-law, Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. He arrived in Yorkshire and straight away began to win battles against the Lancastrians and their allies. At one of these encounters, specifically the Battle of Barnet, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, was killed. That was the end of the Kingmaker. Another figure who died at the battle was Henry Stafford, the new husband of Margaret Beaufort. The family had managed to regain their lands, and they were doing quite well, but this turn of events put an end to their good fortune, as they were supporters of the House of Lancaster. Fearing that the Yorkists might want to get rid of her son, Henry Tudor, Margaret told him to run for his life, and he fled to France.
Run, Forrest! Run away! Hurry!
She wouldn't see Henry again until 14 years later. But perhaps she would consider that wait was worth it, because when she did, it was to see him be crowned King of England, no less. Meanwhile, the last hope of the House of Lancaster, Edward of Westminster, son of Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou, led his side's forces at the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471. That would be their final effort, as they were soundly defeated and Edward was killed, along with several prominent Lancastrian nobles. This victory was decisive for the House of York, since soon afterwards King Henry VI also died. It's not entirely clear how, but it's widely believed that he suffered a mild case of murder. Regardless, the main point is that this was the end of the road for the House of Lancaster. Edward IV of York arrived in London at this time and placed his bottom firmly on the English throne, but he had learned his lesson and quickly purged the country of his enemies, starting with the family of Richard Neville. Throughout the following 12 years, Edward IV managed to rule in relative peace. He had a firm hand and pacified the country by reducing taxes and promoting trade. And also, now that he wasn't spending all his time fighting, he focused his energies on fathering lots of children with his wife, Elizabeth Woodville. The only spot of trouble that remained for Edward was with his own brother, George, Duke of Clarence, the one who had betrayed him by siding with Richard Neville. Apparently, now that Neville was dead, he had turned to necromancy. But he didn't quite manage to master the dark arts, and in 1477 he was captured, imprisoned at the Tower of London, and finally executed, allegedly by drowning in a wine barrel. All things considered, that was not the worst way to die in medieval England. As we said, the situation in England improved considerably throughout this decade. Amidst all this prosperity, King Edward indulged his vices. He was very fond of eating, drinking and womanizing, and quickly became very fat and in poor health. Perhaps this explains why he croaked at the young age of 40, kicking off a new Royal Rumble for the crown in 1483.
At the Royal Rumble match, it's every man for himself. The opportunity of a lifetime.
The main troublemaker was another of Edward's brothers, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, although he didn't really fit the mould of an imposing nobleman, since he was said to be humpbacked and lame. On the other hand, he had married Anne Neville, daughter of Richard Neville, the Kingmaker, so he had gained plenty of land up in the north. The main obstacle keeping Richard from taking the throne was his own nephew and son of the dead king, a 12-year-old boy named, would you believe it, Edward. After some back and forth, and thanks to the support of his mother's family, the Woodvilles, the boy was crowned King Edward V. Richard wasn't happy with this, and pressed Parliament to annul the marriage between Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, on the rather shaky ground that the king had had a prior, legally binding marriage contract which hadn't been properly dissolved, and this technically made all their children illegitimate, or something like that. After some backroom scheming and probably plenty of bribery, let's be honest, this ridiculous legal loophole was accepted. Edward was made to step down, and Richard was offered the throne, thus becoming King Richard III. Yep, that's right, that one. What happened then to Edward V? Well, it isn't very clear. The only thing we know for sure is that he was marched into the Tower of London along with his brother Richard, and they were never seen alive again. Their fate is a mystery, but it's safe to assume that Richard III ordered them killed. In fact, he is generally considered a tyrannical and cruel man, but it's not totally clear how much of this is a black legend. In any case, Richard III only ruled for 2 years because an unexpected challenger came out of nowhere to dispute his crown. It was Henry Tudor, the relatively obscure and distant relative of the House of Lancaster who we mentioned earlier. Let's go over his background briefly. Henry Tudor's mother was Margaret Beaufort, which gave him a legitimate claim to the throne, as he was a direct descendant of Edward III via John of Gaunt. In addition, his father was Edmund Tudor, half-brother of King Henry VI, as the son of Owen Tudor and Catherine of Valois, widow of King Henry V of the House of Lancaster. Yes, I know it's a mess, but believe me, I'm trying my best to keep it as simple as possible. Look, basically, he was sort of like Daenerys Targaryen, but without the dragons, unfortunately, except the one on the flag. Anyway, by this point in the story, Henry's mother Margaret Beaufort had remarried with a very powerful noble, Thomas Stanley, Earl of Derby, and this gained her many influential allies, including the Woodville family. If you recall, our boy Henry Tudor had spent the last 14 years, ever since Edward IV of York took the throne, living in exile in Brittany, and was pretty much penniless. However, thanks to his mother's new contacts, and with the help of the French king, who was always prepared to finance anything that might destabilise the English crown, he gradually put together a fleet and army. In 1485, he disembarked in Wales and quickly made his way towards London, coming up against the royal army of Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth. Given his significant numerical advantage, everything seemed to indicate that King Richard would be victorious. But then, right in the middle of fighting, two of the king's key generals, Thomas Stanley, Henry's stepfather, and his brother, switched sides to support Henry Tudor, and Richard ended up losing the battle. Even more importantly to the story, he also lost his life. In fact, he was the last king of England to be killed on a battlefield. Thus, in 1485, Henry Tudor became King Henry VII of England. Soon afterwards, he married Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, thereby uniting the houses of York and Lancaster into a single line which merged both of them into the House of Tudor.
I think you and I are going to get along just okay.
This was symbolised by combining their emblems into the new Tudor rose. Technically, this put an end to the War of the Roses, but in fact there was a last, albeit smaller, battle in 1487. This was the Battle of Stoke Field, and it was the last attempt by the House of York to take all the power by placing on the throne a boy named Lambert Simnel, who they claimed to be Edward, son of George of Clarence. But Henry VII won that battle, and then proceeded to get rid of pretty much anyone who might be considered a candidate to the throne, thereby securing his position.
He's like, I am the Tiger King.
The rise of the Tudor dynasty marks the passage from medieval to modern times in England, as feudalism gradually disappeared and kings stopped going to battles themselves. And that's a pity, because you can be sure that if leaders had to actually fight in the wars they'd started, we'd have far less of them. The aristocracy also saw its influence wane as a bourgeois middle class began to thrive, hand in hand with an evolution of the English Parliament. While all this was taking place, the monarchy responded by becoming increasingly authoritarian, which predictably led to plenty of trouble, but that's something that we'll explore in a separate series about this specific period.
And the rest is history. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave us a big like. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.